The North Atlantic in April smells of cold iron and distance. There is no land within 1,000 miles. There is no light except the stars, and tonight there are so many of them that the sky seems to press down toward the water as if it wants to touch the darkness below. The sea is flat, completely, unnervingly flat. Experienced sailors have a word for nights like this. They call them mirror nights, and old mariners do not trust mirror nights the way they trust rough water. Rough water announces itself. Mirror nights are quiet about everything. You are somewhere in the middle of it all, in the space between continents, in the hours between one day and the next. Somewhere in this darkness a ship is moving. You cannot see it yet. You can only feel the faint suggestion of it, a vibration in the air that has no explanation, a low harmonic hum that comes not from any instrument you can name but from something much larger and much further away than the stars. The ship is called Titanic. She's 11 days old. She left Southampton on a Wednesday morning with the sun behind her and more than 2,000 people aboard, and she's been moving west without pause ever since, crossing the dark water at 22 knots, her 4 enormous funnels trailing pale smoke into a sky that has, until tonight, been gentle with her. Tonight is different. Tonight the temperature has dropped 11 degrees since sunset. The sea is so still that the ship's reflection would be perfect if you were close enough to see it. The stars are brilliant and cold, and they illuminate nothing. Somewhere in the crow's nest, 40 feet above the deck, a man named Frederick Fleet is looking into the dark. He has been looking for a long time. He has binoculars somewhere in his memory. They were promised to him before the voyage. But tonight there are no binoculars in the crow's nest. Only his eyes, and the dark, and the cold, and the patience that his work requires. By the time the first lifeboat touched the water, there were already not enough seats for the people still asleep below. This is the story of every hour of that night told slowly, so that you can be there for all of it. Settle in. Let the cold Atlantic air drift over you like something soft. There is nowhere to go. The ship is still moving, the stars are still watching, and the night has only just begun. You find yourself standing at the stern rail far back on the ship's afterdeck, in the hour before midnight. The wake behind you is long and white, and it disappears into the dark so completely that it seems, after a moment, as if the ship has always been exactly here, as if there is no world behind it and no world ahead, only this vessel suspended between sky and sea, carrying its cargo of human hope across a body of water that does not care about any of it. The deck is made of teak. It is worn smooth in the places where the most feet have walked, and cold tonight, cold enough that the wood seems to draw warmth from you rather than offer any of its own. The railing is white. The paint on it is so new that it still has a faint chemical smell beneath the salt air, a smell that speaks of Belfast shipyards and the winter months of construction, of the 15,000 men who built this thing with their hands. Titanic is 4 days out from Southampton. She left on a Wednesday, in a crush of crowds and tugboats and noise, and she's been moving west ever since with the kind of steady confidence that enormous things sometimes have. A confidence that comes not from arrogance but from simple physics, from the weight of 46,000 tons of steel that do not stop for minor interruptions. She has crossed the track of 1,000 ships before her. She is crossing it now. The passengers are mostly sleeping, 2,224 of them, distributed across 3 classes and 140 cabins, and a great many bunks and berths and staterooms, each one at a different angle of comfort, each one dreaming something private in this shared darkness. In first class, on the upper decks, the rooms are so quiet that you could hear a pocket watch ticking from across the corridor. In third class, deep in the ship's forward hold, the rooms are warmer and closer together, and the sound of sleeping people has a different quality, less private, more communal, like the sound of a family rather than a collection of individuals. This is where we begin. Not with the iceberg, and not with the lifeboats, and not with the famous names on the passenger manifest. We begin here, in the ordinary darkness of a night that has not yet become what it is about to become. We begin with the ship as she was, magnificent, alive, carrying her people through the cold Atlantic as if she would do so forever. If you enjoy listening to long, calming stories like this one, stories that carry you gently into sleep, consider subscribing. New stories arrive each week, and this one is just beginning. The year is 1912. The world is younger than it seems. There are no airplanes crossing oceans. There are no satellites overhead. The wireless telegraph is still new enough to seem miraculous, and the ships of the White Star Line are among the largest moving objects that human beings have ever made. Titanic is the largest of all of them. She is, as her builders described her, practically unsinkable, a phrase that was never meant to be a boast, only a technical description of a hull designed in 16 watertight compartments, designed to float even when 4 of them were fully flooded. The designers did not know about 5. No one had thought carefully enough about 5. But that understanding is still hours away. Right now the ship is moving. Right now the stars are out. Right now, in the wireless room amidships, a young operator named Jack Phillips is sending passenger telegrams into the dark. Love letters, business cables, holiday messages from wealthy travellers who find the novelty of wireless communication irresistible. His fingers move over the key with practiced ease. He has been at it for hours. He will keep going. And far ahead, in the direction the ship is moving, in the place the ship has not yet reached, something is floating in the dark. It has been floating for years. It came down from the glaciers of Greenland on a journey measured in seasons rather than days, and it has been drifting south and west through the spring melt, slowly, quietly, until tonight it sits in the ship's path like a question that no one has thought to ask. The lookouts in the crow's nest cannot see it yet. The officers on the bridge do not know its exact location. The passengers who are still awake in the smoking rooms and lounges are talking about other things, about New York, about business, about the menu for tomorrow's lunch. The night is still ordinary, the ship is still whole. The story is not yet turned. Rest in that moment with me. Let the ship carry you. The engines below are a low hum, a vibration more felt than heard, something that travels up through the deck and into the soles of your feet if you stand still long enough. The stars overhead are the same stars that have watched every ocean crossing since the first humans built boats and pointed them toward the horizon. They are patient. They have seen this before. They will see it again. We have until dawn. Settle in. To understand what happened on the night of April the 14th, you have to understand what the ship was during the days before it. Titanic was not only a vessel, she was a small city, organized in the way that cities of 1912 were organized, by class, by money, by the invisible but entirely real lines that separated people who had less, and people who had almost nothing at all. First class occupied the upper decks. The rooms there were not ship cabins in any ordinary sense. They were rooms that could have belonged to fine hotels in London or Paris, rooms with actual fireplaces, with 4-poster beds, with private promenades where passengers could walk in the sea air without encountering anyone they had not specifically chosen to encounter. The most expensive suite on the ship cost, in 1912 terms, the equivalent of what a skilled worker might earn in several years. The people in those suites had not thought carefully about the cost. People who could afford Titanic's first class did not, as a rule, think carefully about costs. John Jacob Astor IV was among them. He was 47 years old and one of the wealthiest men alive. His family had made its original fortune in fur trading before pivoting elegantly to Manhattan real estate, and by 1912 the Astor name was synonymous with a particular kind of American money, the kind that had been accumulating long enough to develop its own gravity. He was travelling with his new wife Madeleine, who was 18, pregnant with their first child together, and somewhat accustomed to the particular social scrutiny that attached to being young, and recently married to an extremely famous older man. She had handled it with more grace than might have been expected. Benjamin Guggenheim was there as well, another figure from the world of great American money. His family had made theirs in mining, in the kind of industrial extraction that turned whole mountains into wealth. Guggenheim was known for a certain quality of living, for an appreciation of beautiful things and beautiful people, for the careful selection of everything that surrounded him. He had brought his valet aboard and his personal secretary in several very good suits. He would be seen in the final hours of the night wearing one of the best of them. Isidore and Ida Strauss were perhaps the most quietly beloved couple on the ship. Isidore had built Macy's department store into something that defined New York retail, and he and Ida had been together for so long that people who knew them said they had developed a kind of synchrony, the same sentences finishing at the same moment, the same instinct to reach for the other's hand in moments of uncertainty. They were returning from a winter spent in Europe. They were looking forward to home. These are the famous names. They appear in every account of the disaster, and they deserve to appear, because their stories matter. But the majority of the people aboard Titanic were not famous. The majority were in second class, where the accommodations were comfortable and modest, and where the passengers tended to be professionals and clergy and middle-class families with aspirations and plans. And below them, in third class, were the immigrants. The third-class passengers are the ones whose names have been hardest to recover, whose individual stories have taken the longest to piece together from the fragments of records and letters and family memory that survived. They came from Ireland and Sweden and Italy and Lebanon and Finland and a dozen other places, and most of them were young, and most of them were moving toward lives they had been planning for a long time. America was not a metaphor for them. It was a specific destination, a city, a relative's address, a job that had been promised, a community that had sent word back home that it was worth making the crossing. The Sage family from England were among them, John and Annie Sage with their 9 children, the youngest 4 years old and the oldest 20, all of them making the journey together to Florida, where John had heard there was work. The children had spent much of the voyage exploring the third-class decks, counting the rivets in the corridor walls, watching the sea from the well deck in the bow. Annie had been keeping careful track of all 9 of them, the way mothers of large families develop a sixth sense, an awareness of which child is too quiet, which one has gotten into something, which one needs watching. Eugene Daly from County Galway had saved for years to afford his ticket. He had brought his Willin pipes aboard, the traditional Irish instrument that takes a lifetime to learn properly, and that sounds, when played well, like grief transformed into something almost bearable. He had played for the third-class passengers on the first evening and then again on the second, and people from other countries had come to listen even though they didn't know the music. They came because music in a shared language doesn't require translation, because the sound of it did something to the air in the general room that made everyone in it feel, briefly, less far from home. All of these people were sleeping when the watch changed at 10 o'clock on the night of April the 14th. The first-class passengers had retired from their dinner and their after-dinner conversations and their card games, drifting toward their staterooms in the gentle way that people drift towards sleep on ships, carried by the motion and the warmth and the particular exhaustion of having done nothing all day in very comfortable surroundings. The second-class passengers had said their goodnights in the lounge. The third-class passengers had settled into their bunks and berths. The ship moved through the dark. The engines maintained their constant hum. The officers on the bridge kept their watches, and in the crow's nest, 40 feet above everything, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stood in the cold and looked at the sky and at the sea and at the junction between them where anything could be hiding. What time did you get comfortable tonight? What hour did the day release you? Somewhere in that ship someone was having the same thought, grateful for warmth, for stillness, for the luxury of not being required to do anything until morning. Let yourself settle into that feeling now. The ship is still whole. The night is still young. We are still in the hours before everything changes, and those hours deserve their full weight. The Titanic had received several ice warnings during the day. The ships that crossed the North Atlantic in April did so in waters that were rarely free of ice. The winter melt pushed bergs south from the Arctic into the shipping lanes, and captains and wireless operators exchanged ice position reports as a routine courtesy, the way drivers might warn each other about road conditions. On April the 14th, the warnings had been more specific than usual. The Carronia had reported bergs in the morning, the Baltic had reported them in the afternoon, and Captain Smith had briefly shown the message to J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, who was travelling aboard as an observer, a practice that was common for shipping executives and that would become, in retrospect, one of the most discussed decisions of the voyage. Ismay had put the message in his pocket. He had shown it to some passengers later that afternoon. This detail too would be discussed and argued over for years. What it meant, whether it influenced anything, whether the casual circulation of an ice warning among first-class passengers suggested an attitude toward danger that was more relaxed than circumstances warranted. Captain Edward Smith had been crossing the North Atlantic for 40 years. He was 62, and he had been given command of Titanic as a kind of honour. Her maiden voyage was intended as a celebration, and Smith was the White Star Line's most distinguished captain, the man that wealthy passengers requested by name. His retirement was planned. This was to be his last voyage before it. The decision to maintain the ship's speed through the ice warning area was, in 1912, a normal decision. Ships did not slow for ice unless the conditions specifically required it. The sea was calm. The visibility was good. The standard procedure was to post extra lookouts, maintain the watch, and proceed. These are facts that matter, not because they assign blame, but because they explain the texture of the night's early hours, the way everything felt ordinary right up until the moment it did not. The people in their bunks were sleeping because there was nothing to suggest they should not be sleeping. The officers on the bridge were watchful because watchfulness was their professional habit, not because they believed something was wrong. The night had the quality of all the nights before it, on all the crossings before this one. Only the cold was different. Only the temperature, dropping steadily since sunset, suggested that something in the water ahead was not water. Before she was a disaster, she was a construction project. Before she was a symbol, she was a set of specifications, numbers on engineering drawings, plans for steel plates and rivets and frames and internal bulkheads, a blueprint of something that would be, when finished, the largest moving object that human beings had ever made. The Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast was the place where the numbers became metal, where the drawings became hull, where the idea became a ship. The yard was enormous. It occupied a stretch of the River Lagan's eastern bank, a complex of slipways and machine shops and warehouses and offices that employed, at the time of Titanic's construction, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 men. The number is imprecise because the workforce fluctuated, skilled trades came and went as projects demanded, and the work of building a ship drew on the full range of industrial craft available in Edwardian Belfast. There were riveters and platers and caulkers and painters and carpenters and electricians and plumbers, and men who specialised in specific aspects of ship fitting that had no name outside the trade. The keel of Titanic was laid on March 31st, 1909, on Slipway 3, the same slipway that had been used for Olympic, the first of the Three Sisters. The keel is the backbone of a ship, the central structural member that runs the length of the hull from bow to stern, and laying it is the beginning of everything, the point at which a ship becomes a real object rather than a plan. When the keel of Titanic was laid, there were men in Belfast who had been building ships their entire working lives, who knew the sound of a good rivet being driven home, who could judge the quality of a steel plate by the way it rang when you struck it, who understood ships the way a cabinet maker understands wood. The rivets deserve particular attention. They are not glamorous. They are not the grand staircase or the first-class dining room or any of the things that appear in the photographs of Titanic's interior. But they are the thing that held the ship together, the material that connected the steel plates of the hull to each other and to the frames, the material through which all the structural forces of the ship's life in the water were transmitted. There were approximately 3 million of them in Titanic, and they were driven by hand. Not by machines, but by teams of men working together, one holding the heated rivet in place with tongs, while another drove it from the opposite side with a hammer. The riveters worked in squads of 4, a heater who kept the rivets in a small portable furnace, a holder-on who caught the hot rivet and held it against the steel with tongs, and 2 drivers who hammered it flat from the other side in alternating strokes. They were paid by the rivet, so many shillings per 100 rivets driven, and they worked fast because fast was how you earned a living wage at peace rates. The sound of 3 million rivets being driven was the sound of Belfast working class making something extraordinary out of iron and muscle. The steel for Titanic came from the steel mills of England and Scotland, arriving at the yard as plates of various thicknesses depending on where in the ship they would be used. The hull plating was the thickest, the internal bulkheads somewhat thinner, the upper decks thinner still. The plates were fitted together in a system called clinker or lap-straight construction, for some sections and flush plating for others, each plate overlapping or meeting the next in a specific way that the naval architects had calculated to produce the necessary strength. Thomas Andrews supervised the construction personally, visiting the yard daily during the years of building, making the kinds of observations that distinguished a great designer from a merely competent one. He noticed things that other people missed, the way a particular section of framing would be under more stress than the drawing suggested, the way the installation of a piece of equipment in one location would make maintenance more difficult in 10 years than if it were placed 6 inches to the left. He made notes, he argued with foremen, He revised drawings. He was there. The ship that emerged from the slipway on May 31st, 1911, when she was launched into the Lagan, was not yet Titanic in the sense of a completed ship. She was a hull, a shell, a structure without her engines and her interior fittings and her decks and her furnishings. The fitting out that followed her launch took another year, during which the machinery was installed, and the plumbing and the electrical systems and the woodwork and the carpets and the paintings and the thousands of other items that made the ship not just seaworthy but livable. The first-class staterooms were fitted with furniture equivalent to what you might find in the finest London hotels. The dining rooms were panelled in carved wood. The Turkish baths were tiled in the style of an Ottoman hammam. The swimming pool was lined and plumbed and filled. By April 1912, when she was ready for sea trials and then for her maiden voyage, she was not only the largest ship ever built, but also the most technologically advanced. Her wireless apparatus had a range that exceeded most shore stations. Her engines, a combination of reciprocating steam engines and a low-pressure turbine, produced 30,000 horsepower and could drive the ship at over 23 knots. Her hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments by bulkheads that could be closed in approximately 30 seconds from the bridge. She had a telephone system that connected all areas of the ship. She had hot and cold running water in every first-class cabin. She had electric lights throughout, which was itself still something of a luxury on ships of that era. Lord William James Peary, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, had built ships for his entire professional life and was considered one of the foremost figures in British shipbuilding. He was the one who had sat with J. Bruce Ismay in 1907 and sketched out the idea of 3 great liners that would make the White Star Line's North Atlantic service the dominant one in the world, not through speed, which Cunard had claimed with its Mauretania and Lusitania, but through size and luxury and a particular quality of experience that would make travelling on a White Star ship seem like something different from travelling on any other ship. The plan worked in the limited sense that the ships were built, and they were extraordinary, and they attracted exactly the passengers Peary and Ismay had imagined. The flaw in the plan was not in the conception or the execution, but in the assumption that the ocean would cooperate with the idea that size and luxury were adequate defences against what the ocean actually contained. The ocean contained ice in April, in the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic, and ice did not care about grand staircases or first-class dining rooms or the warmth of a swimming pool that had been heated with the best available technology. The people who built Titanic were proud of her. This is not a small thing, and it should not be dismissed in the retrospective sadness that the disaster throws back over everything that preceded it. The men who drove the 3 million rivets, and the engineers who designed the watertight compartments, and the carpenters who fitted the panelling in the first-class smoking room, and Thomas Andrews who walked every deck with his notebook. They had built something magnificent, and they knew it, and the pride was legitimate. The ship was magnificent. It was also not unsinkable, but that was a different matter, and one that no one fully understood yet. She sailed from Southampton on April 10th, 1912, with coal smoke from her 3 working funnels trailing behind her, and the 4th funnel, the dummy, added for aesthetic symmetry, providing its decorative contribution to the impression of power. The crowds on the docks were substantial. The newspapers had been covering the maiden voyage extensively. People had come to watch the largest ship in the world leave the port, and the largest ship in the world did not disappoint. She was very large, and she moved through the harbour with the ponderous grace of something too big to be hurried. There was an incident as she left. The wash from her enormous propellers caused a smaller ship, the New York, to break free from its moorings and drift toward Titanic's side. For several anxious minutes the 2 ships converged, and it seemed possible that the maiden voyage of the world's most famous ship might end in a collision before she had cleared the harbour. Quick work by the harbour tugs and some skilled manoeuvring by Captain Smith averted the collision, but the moment was noted, was commented upon, was filed in the memory of those who witnessed it. Ships and the sea and the unexpected, these 3 had already made their first appearance in the story of Titanic's maiden voyage, and the voyage was barely 20 minutes old. She stopped at Cherbourg in France to pick up passengers, including some of the wealthiest who had crossed from England on special tenders, and then at Queenstown in Ireland, where additional passengers came aboard, many of them Irish emigrants making the crossing to America. At Queenstown she stood at anchor in the harbour while the tenders came and went, and people on shore who had come to watch remembered her later as something almost dreamlike. Enormous, brilliant white on the upper works, black on the hull, 4 great funnels standing against a spring sky, the largest ship in the world standing in an Irish harbour, like a visiting dignity that was too big for the space it occupied. And then she moved out into the Atlantic, and the course was set, and the ordinary business of an ocean crossing began. Meals and walks on deck and card games in the smoking room, and the wireless operators tapping out messages and the engines humming and the days passing. The weather was perfect. The ship performed exactly as she was designed to perform. Everything was as it should be for 4 days. The wireless room was located on the boat deck, just aft of the officers' quarters, in a space barely large enough for 2 men and their equipment. It smelled of warm metal and the particular dry heat of electrical apparatus, and the sound in it was constant. The clicking and chattering of Morse code coming in from ships and shore stations across hundreds of miles of ocean. A conversation in dots and dashes that never paused, that had been running without interruption since the ship left Southampton. Jack Phillips was 25 years old. He had been working as a wireless operator for the Marconi Company since he was a teenager, and he was considered one of their best. Quick and accurate, capable of receiving and sending at speeds that impressed other operators, the kind of person whose fingers seemed to understand Morse code independently of any conscious thought. He wore headphones for most of his shift, and the headphones created a particular quality of isolation, a bubble of sound and concentration inside which the rest of the ship's life was only faintly present. Harold Bride was 22, Phillips' junior operator, and he had a quality of cheerfulness that Phillips sometimes found tiring and sometimes found genuinely comforting. They worked alternating shifts. There was more wireless traffic on a ship like Titanic than 2 men could handle continuously, and they had developed the easy shorthand of colleagues who have spent more time in each other's company than in anyone else's. The passenger messages were the problem. In 1912, the ability to send and receive wireless messages from the middle of the ocean was still new enough to seem magical, and the first-class passengers in particular could not resist using it for everything, for business cables, for personal messages to family and friends, for the simple pleasure of demonstrating that the technology worked, that you could speak to New York from a position somewhere between continents, and that New York would answer. Phillips and Bride had been processing a backlog of passenger messages for most of the day, and as evening moved toward night, the backlog had not shrunk. The volume was enormous. The Cape Race shore station, which was relaying messages between Titanic and the American mainland, was crowded with traffic. The ice warnings were a different kind of message, official, navigational, addressed to the bridge rather than to passengers. Several had come in during the day and had been duly delivered, walked to the officers on watch and noted in the ship's log. But as the evening progressed and the passenger backlog mounted, the line between official traffic and personal traffic began, perhaps, to blur a little in the way that urgency blurs things when urgency is everywhere. At 9:40 in the evening, the Mesaba sent a message to Titanic that was direct and specific. The Mesaba had been crossing the same waters earlier and had found heavy pack ice and large icebergs directly in the area that Titanic was now approaching. The message gave coordinates. It was the most precisely located ice warning of the day, the one that pointed most directly at the patch of water Titanic would reach in the next hour or 2. Phillips received the message. He was in the middle of clearing the passenger backlog. He set the Mesaba's message to the side, intending to deliver it to the bridge when the immediate queue had been dealt with. The bridge did not receive it that night. This is one of those details that history keeps returning to, that investigators and writers and ordinary people who have read about the disaster keep circling, trying to determine what it means. Would the Mesaba message have changed anything? Would Captain Smith, reading those specific coordinates, have slowed the ship or altered course? It is impossible to know. What is known is that the message existed, that it was accurate, and that it did not reach the people who might have acted on it. At 10:30, a different ship came onto the wireless frequency. The Californian was a mid-sized steamer that had stopped for the night, stopped completely, engines shut down, because her captain had decided that navigating through ice in the dark was more dangerous than sitting still until daylight. She was not far from Titanic. Estimates vary, but she was somewhere between 10 and 20 miles away, close enough that her wireless operator, a young Scotsman named Cyril Evans, was receiving Titanic's signals at a volume that suggested proximity. Evans began sending a message to Phillips. "We are stopped and surrounded by ice. The transmission was so close, so loud in Philip's headphones, that it startled him. The signal strength of a nearby transmitter can physically hurt if you're unprepared for it, and Phillips was tired. He had been at the key for hours. He had a backlog of passenger messages still waiting to be sent. The Californian's message was not formatted as a navigational warning with the appropriate prefix. It came in as a general transmission, the kind that interrupted whatever you were doing. Philip sent back, "Shut up, shut up, I am busy, I am working Cape Race." Evans, offended, took off his headphones and went to bed. He would not put them on again that night. The Californian's wireless set went dark at 10:35, and it would not come back on until morning. This exchange, these few words between two tired young men in the middle of the Atlantic, would be examined for a century afterward. Phillips is not a villain in this story, only a human being doing a demanding job at the end of a long shift, responding to an intrusion the way many people respond to intrusions when they are tired and behind on their work. But the consequences of those words, of Evans going to bed, of the Californian going silent, those consequences were very large. In the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet's eyes were adapting to the dark. He had been up there since 10 o'clock, and his eyes had made the slow adjustment that eyes make when there is very little light, pupils widening, the rods in the retina taking over from the cones, the world becoming visible in shades of darkness rather than colour. The sea ahead was very dark. The sky above it was very bright with stars. The line where they met was the most important line in his world tonight, and he watched it the way a person watches something they do not quite trust. He did not have binoculars. The binoculars that were supposed to be in the crow's nest were missing. They had been locked away in a locker, and the officer who had the key had been transferred off the ship in Southampton without passing the key along. Whether binoculars would have made a difference is a question that has no certain answer. Perhaps they would have allowed Fleet to see the iceberg 30 seconds earlier. Perhaps 30 seconds would have been enough. Perhaps it would not have been. The mathematics of these counterfactuals are uncertain, and uncertainty is one of the things that make the Titanic story so persistent. So many moments where a different choice might have led somewhere else, and so little way to know. At 11 o'clock, First Officer William Murdoch took the watch on the bridge. He was a Scotsman in his late 30s, experienced and methodical, with the kind of steady competence that inspires trust in officers under him and captains above him. He took his position at the front of the bridge and looked out at the sea, and what he saw was exactly what was supposed to be there: a calm, dark, ordinary night. He was not complacent. The temperature reports had been noted. The ice warnings that had been delivered to the bridge during the day were in his mind. He had the ship running at 22 knots, which was her normal service speed, and the conditions seemed adequate for that speed. Good visibility, calm sea, experienced lookouts. This was the standard procedure. This was what captains and first officers had been doing on these crossings for decades. And somewhere ahead, perhaps 12 miles, perhaps 10, perhaps somewhat less, the iceberg was where it had always been tonight, patient and enormous, and mostly hidden below the surface in the way that icebergs always are, the famous 9/10 beneath the water, the 1/10 above it catching no light from a sky that provided none. The time was 11 o'clock. 40 minutes remained. Let that thought settle quietly. 40 minutes of ordinary night, of normal watch, of people sleeping and engines humming, and a young man in a cold crow's nest watching the dark line where the sea met the sky. The first 3 days of the voyage had been, by all accounts, a remarkable experience. The ship had settled into the rhythm that all large ships settle into after the excitement of departure, a rhythm of meals and walks and rest and conversation, organised by the ship's daily schedule and the natural patterns of a community of people who have found themselves, unexpectedly, in each other's company for 4 days. The food in first class was extraordinary. This has been documented in considerable detail because several of the menus survived and because survivors spoke about it in their accounts, and what emerges is a picture of culinary ambition that was matched only by the setting in which it was served. The first-class dining saloon occupied the full width of the ship on D-deck and could seat 550 passengers at once in an arrangement of tables that provided a balance between privacy and sociability. It was decorated in the Jacobean style: dark wood panelling, leather chairs, the kinds of surfaces and proportions that communicated solidity and comfort, and the particular kind of reassurance that expensive things provide when you're in the middle of an ocean. The chef in the first-class kitchen was French, as first-class chefs on great ships tended to be in 1912, and the kitchen was equipped with the most advanced cooking technology available. A typical dinner in first class began with oysters or hors d'oeuvres and proceeded through soup, fish, an entree, a roast, vegetable dishes, desserts, cheeses, and fruits, accompanied by wines from an extensive cellar that had been loaded in Southampton. The whole production took several hours and was conducted with a formality that spoke of the era's belief in the connection between ceremony and civilization. The à la carte restaurant was a different experience, smaller, more intimate, run by Luigi Gatti, who had been brought from his restaurants in London's Strand specifically for this voyage. Gatti's restaurant offered a menu that changed daily, and a service style more like a fine restaurant than a ship's dining room, with the kind of attention to individual preference that was expensive to provide and that first-class passengers had come to expect. Several passengers chose to dine there exclusively, finding it more to their taste than the larger formal dining room. In second class, the food was surprisingly good, better by most accounts than first class on many other ships. The White Star Line's policy was to give each class something that exceeded what they might have expected, and second class benefited from this policy considerably. The second class dining room was also in the Jacobean style, though smaller and less elaborate than first class, and the menu was simpler but well executed. Lawrence Beasley, who was a careful observer of everything, noted that the food in second class would have satisfied anyone who was not looking for luxury specifically. Third class received simpler fare, porridge and bread and tea in the mornings, hearty stews and roasted meats at the main meal of the day, simple puddings and fruit for dessert. By the standards of what many third-class passengers had been eating before boarding the ship, this was better than their ordinary diet. For the immigrants who had scraped together the price of a ticket over years of saving, the food provided by the White Star Line was part of the package, part of the value of the journey, and it was received as such. The daily routine for passengers varied by class and by temperament. The first-class promenade deck offered a half-mile circuit around the ship that serious walkers completed multiple times each day, the salt air and the movement of the ship providing the kind of exercise that wealthy people found beneficial after elaborate meals. The Turkish baths and the gymnasium were open at various hours, and the swimming pool had its schedule. The smoking room was in perpetual use by the gentlemen, a space that operated somewhere between a gentleman's club and an informal business meeting room, where deals were made and opinions expressed, and card games conducted with stakes that reflected the wealth of the participants. Captain Smith made his regular appearances through the ship. He had a gift for this, for being present without being intrusive, for stopping at a table and spending 5 minutes in conversation that left the people he spoke with feeling that they had been noticed and valued by the person most responsible for their safe passage. He was 62 years old and had been doing this for decades, and the practice had the ease of something so long established that it no longer required thought, only the steady application of attention and courtesy. The children aboard were a particularly lively element of the crossing. Titanic carried a surprising number of children, somewhere between 100 and 120, distributed across all three classes, and they had, as children do, made the ship their own. The long corridors of the lower decks were ideal for running. The decks offered the wind and the water. The crew members, particularly the stewards, had been charmed by the smaller children and had adopted them informally, teaching them things about the ship, showing them the engine or the telegraph, letting them into spaces that were technically restricted, but that no one was inclined to enforce the restriction for a 5-year-old. Lorraine Allison was 2 years old and travelling in first class with her parents and her baby brother Trevor and his nanny. She had the quality of presence that some small children have, the kind of directness and warmth that makes adults feel welcomed rather than assessed, that approaches strangers as potential friends rather than potential threats. The stewards loved her. She could often be found in the kitchens or on the bridge, in the company of some crew member who had been recruited into playing with her while her parents attended to other things. On the morning of April the 14th, the last full day before the disaster, the ship was moving through particularly clear and beautiful conditions. The sea was so calm that it barely registered as a sea. It was more like a very large lake, still enough that the ship's wake spread evenly in both directions and persisted long after the ship had passed. The sky was a cold, clear blue that deepened toward the horizon in a way that experienced sailors associated with specific weather conditions that included in the North Atlantic in April the presence of ice. The day passed pleasantly for everyone aboard. Meals were served, walks were taken, card games were played, conversations were had. Thomas Andrews was everywhere with his notebook. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were managing the wireless traffic, which was heavy. It was always heavy with a full complement of first-class passengers who wanted to communicate with the world they were crossing. The officers on the bridge maintained their watches, noting the ice warnings that came in through the wireless and adding them to the chart, calculating positions and distances. Ice was mentioned at lunch. Captain Smith had received the Baltic's ice warning earlier and had, apparently casually, shown it to Ismay, who had put it in his pocket. The message made the rounds of the first-class lounge in the afternoon, passed between passengers as a curiosity rather than a concern. Ice, imagine it, ice in April. Some passengers went to the forward rail to look for icebergs, scanning the horizon with the expectant attention of people who have been told there might be something interesting to see and are making an occasion of looking for it. They saw nothing. The ice, if it was there, was not visible. Sunset on April the 14th was spectacular. This too appears in the survivor accounts, the way the sun went down in a particular quality of light, orange and red against a sky so clear that the colours seemed to deepen rather than fade as the sun descended. People came on deck to watch it. John Jacob Astor and Madeline were there. She wrapped in a coat against the air that was turning cold with the sun's departure. The Strauss couple were there. Various second-class passengers had come up to the promenade to watch. It was the kind of sunset that people comment on, that becomes a conversational topic at dinner. Did you see it? Wasn't it extraordinary? After the sunset, the temperature continued to drop. The warmth that had characterized the days of the crossing was gone now, replaced by a cold that was different in quality from ordinary April cold. Sharper, drier, the kind of cold that moves inside clothing more easily. The reason was ice. The ship was approaching the area where the ice warnings had placed the main ice field, and the ice was cooling the air above it in the way that large bodies of frozen water cool the air they sit beneath. The cold was a message that no one on deck that evening was reading correctly, except possibly some of the older crew members who had made this crossing before, and knew what a temperature drop of this particular kind and speed tended to indicate. By 10 o'clock, most passengers had gone below. The evening entertainments in the various lounges had wound down. The smoking rooms had their usual contingent of late-night card players. The wireless room was humming with traffic. The officers were at their posts. The ship moved through the dark at 22 knots, her lights bright against the cold sky, her funnels trailing smoke into air that was now close to freezing. This was the last ordinary hour. After this, the night would become something else entirely. But in this hour, 10 o'clock, the watch just changed, the lookouts in the crow's nest settling in for their shift. The ship was exactly what she had always been, magnificent, whole, moving purposefully through the dark toward the destination she had promised her passengers she would reach. If you are still with me now, drifting through this dark April night, subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well and let the ship carry you forward. At 11:39 and some seconds, Frederick Fleet saw something change. The darkness ahead of the ship, the line where the sea met the sky, had a new quality to it. There was a shape in it that had not been there before. It was darker than the dark around it, a solid interruption in the pattern of the night, and it was growing. Not quickly, not with the sudden urgency of something close, but growing, the way a thought grows when you first notice it, unmistakably there and getting larger and requiring attention. Fleet reached for the bell. The crow's nest was equipped with a telephone that connected to the bridge, and beside it a brass bell that was used for lookout signals. 1 ring for something off to the right, 2 for something to the left, 3 for something directly ahead. He rang 3 times. He picked up the telephone. The bridge answered immediately. It was 6th Officer James Moody, the youngest officer aboard, 24 years old and still new enough to his position to answer telephones with a particular crispness. "Iceberg," Fleet said, "right ahead." Moody relayed the message to First Officer Murdoch, who was already moving. Murdoch had been watching the crow's nest, had seen Fleet reach for the bell, and his body was in motion before the words arrived. He crossed to the helmsman, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who had the wheel, and gave the order, harder starboard. This was the order to turn the wheel as far as it would go to the right, which would swing the ship's bow to the left, away from what was ahead. At the same moment, Murdoch grabbed the engine telegraph and rang down to the engine room, full astern. He wanted the engines reversed, the enormous propellers pushed backward against the ship's forward momentum. He also threw the switch to close the watertight doors. All of this happened within seconds. Murdoch's response was professional, immediate, correct by the standards of the time and training available to him. The question was not whether he responded correctly. The question was whether it was possible, in the time available, to move a ship of 46,000 tons out of the way of an obstacle that had appeared 37 seconds before impact. The answer was no, but the attempt was real and worthy and nearly worked. The bow began to swing. The ship was turning, had turned enough that what might have been a head-on collision was becoming a glancing blow, the iceberg passing down the starboard side rather than meeting the bow directly. For a moment, watching from somewhere above the scene, it might have seemed as though the ship would clear it. The bow swung left. The iceberg, dark and massive, was at the starboard side. The ship was moving and turning, and the math was not enough. The starboard hull made contact below the waterline somewhere in the area of the forecastle, the forward part of the ship, and the contact lasted 37 seconds. Not a single sharp impact, but a drawn-out encounter, the iceberg moving down the length of the ship's hull, the contact varying in intensity, in some places breaking through the steel plates and in other places only flexing them, the whole long transaction conducted below the waterline where no one could see it, and only a very few people could feel it clearly. To the passengers, it felt like almost nothing. This is one of the things about the Titanic disaster that surprises people when they encounter it, how small the collision felt from inside the ship. Those who were still awake described a slight shudder, a trembling of the floor, a sound like something being dragged along the hull. Some described it as feeling like the ship had run over gravel or scraped against a dock. Some thought it was nothing. A few passengers who had been sleeping woke at the sound and then, hearing nothing further, went back to sleep. On the decks, things were more apparent. Chunks of ice had carved off the iceberg as it passed and had fallen onto the forward well deck, the open area where third-class passengers spent their outdoor time. Some men who were still up came out to look at the ice, picked pieces of it up, marvelled at the novelty. One account says someone kicked a piece around like a football. The mood, in these first minutes, was curious rather than alarmed. The ship had obviously encountered something. The something was obviously ice. The ice was here on the deck as evidence of the encounter. This seemed like the kind of incident that ships encountered and recovered from, that would be mentioned in the ship's log and perhaps discussed at dinner the following day. Below the waterline, the damage was doing what damage does, spreading quietly through the dark spaces of the ship's lower decks, filling the compartments that were designed to hold it, approaching the points at which the design's assumptions would be tested. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was in his cabin on E-deck when he felt the impact. He had been at sea for most of the 4 days since Southampton, walking the ship with his notebook, writing down the things that were right and the things that could be improved. He had been doing this on every ship he built, and he had built many, and he had never felt an impact quite like this one, not in its intensity, which was modest, but in its character, in the way it stopped rather than continuing. When a ship brushes against something minor, there is a single event. What Andrews felt had a duration that his experience told him was wrong. He dressed quickly. He went to find Captain Smith. Smith had retired to his cabin at 10:30, leaving Murdoch in charge of the bridge, and he had been awake or nearly awake since the impact. The stopping of the engines, which always preceded some kind of event, had already brought him to the edge of alertness. He was on the bridge within moments. Murdoch gave him the account, the iceberg, the order, the attempt to turn, the contact. Smith sent for Andrews. The two men went below together, into the depths of the ship, into the spaces that passengers rarely saw. The mailroom, the cargo holds, the forward compartments below the waterline. What they found was water. Not a flood, not a wall of it, not the dramatic rupture of something exploding. Just water, present where it should not be, filling the mailroom up to its knees, rising in the cargo holds, standing in the squash court on G-deck, coming in through the seams and punctures in the hull, at a rate that was steady and patient and very difficult to look at because of what it meant. Andrews did the calculations in his head. He had built this ship. He knew every compartment, every bulkhead, every pump. He knew how much water the ship could absorb and how quickly it could absorb it before the weight and the buoyancy equations shifted beyond recovery. He counted the compartments that were flooding. He counted the ones that were intact. He calculated. He needed 4 intact compartments for the ship to float. He had 5 flooding ones. He stood in the cold, wet lower deck of the ship he had designed and loved, and he told Captain Smith what time it was. What time in the sense of how much remained, not on any clock, but in the life of the ship. An hour and a half, perhaps 2 hours. After that, the water in the forward compartments would rise above the tops of the bulkheads, would spill into the next ones, and the next, in a progression that nothing in the ship's design was capable of stopping. What does it feel like to know that the thing you built is going to be gone in 2 hours? Andrews did not record his thoughts. He had work to do, and he did it. But the question sits in the air of that moment, in the dim light of those wet lower decks, and it has no answer that would satisfy anyone. The time was 12:05 in the morning. April the 15th had begun. The ice had done its work, and the ship was beginning, very slowly and very surely, to die. The flooding of Titanic proceeded by compartments, and the compartments are worth understanding because the way they filled determined the way the ship died. The ship's hull had been divided into 16 watertight compartments by 15 transverse bulkheads, walls of steel that ran across the ship from one side of the hull to the other, dividing the interior into sections that could, in theory, be isolated from each other if flooding occurred. The system worked in the sense that it was intended to work. The flooding was contained within the forward compartments. It did not spread laterally all at once to every part of the ship. But the containment was temporary rather than permanent, and the reason was the bulkheads. The bulkheads did not extend to the top of the ship. They extended to E-deck. They were 10 to 15 feet above the ship's waterline under normal conditions, and under normal conditions this was more than adequate. But as the ship's bow sank under the weight of flooding water, the waterline was no longer in its normal position. The ship was settling forward, the bow going down and the stern coming up, and as it settled, the water in the forward compartments rose above the tops of the bulkheads and spilled into the next compartment aft, and then into the next one. It was a progression, not a rush, not a flood all at once, but a steady, inevitable creep. One compartment after another, each filling and spilling into the next as the bow sank lower. If the bulkheads had extended all the way to the main deck, the flooding might have been contained. The water would have filled the forward compartments, and the ship would have floated at a severe angle. Very uncomfortable, probably unusable, but it would have floated. Some naval architects reviewing the disaster afterward calculated that the ship might have remained afloat for 12 hours or more if the bulkheads had been extended. This was 12 hours that the Carpathia or another ship might have used to reach her. The bulkheads were not extended because extending them to the full height of the ship would have made certain internal spaces, particularly the first-class reception rooms and the second-class dining room, difficult to lay out without interruption. The bulkheads would have divided rooms in ways that the designers considered aesthetically and functionally undesirable. The decision to stop the bulkheads at E-deck was a design decision made in the context of what the ship was supposed to be, a luxury liner with large, elegant shared spaces, rather than in the context of what might happen if 5 compartments flooded simultaneously. These were not foolish people. Andrews was brilliant. The Harland and Wolff design team was among the best in the world. But they were designing a ship for a specific purpose, in the context of specific assumptions about what kinds of damage were likely and what kinds were not, and the specific damage that Titanic actually received fell outside the zone that their assumptions had covered. The mailroom is a detail that appears in accounts of the flooding and that has particular quality. The specificity of it, the way it makes abstract flooding concrete. The mailroom was on G-deck toward the bow, and it was where the 11 sacks of registered mail and the several thousand sacks of ordinary mail were stored. The mailroom had clerks, 5 of them, 3 Americans and 2 British, who were responsible for the mail during the voyage. When flooding began, these men went to the mailroom to try to save the registered mail, which represented the postal contracts and which they understood as their professional responsibility. They carried sacks of mail up from G-deck to the higher decks as the water rose. They worked in the rising water, hauling the sacks, moving them to higher ground, doing the job that their employment required of them in circumstances that their employment had not anticipated. They were seen by crew members and passengers going about this work in the first hour after the collision. None of them survived. What the mailroom clerks were doing was what many people on the ship were doing in the hours after the collision, continuing to do the specific thing they had been doing, the thing that defined their presence on the ship, because the situation had not yet presented itself clearly enough to make the continuation of ordinary work seem absurd. The moment when ordinary work becomes absurd is not always obvious from the inside. From the outside, looking back, it is easy to see where the point was. From the inside, at the moment, it is much less clear. The engineering crew had a clearer sense of the situation from earlier in the night. The men in the boiler rooms and the engine rooms were closest to the flooding. They could hear it, in some cases feel it, through the hull. The decision to keep the engines running, to keep the electrical power available, was made in full knowledge that keeping the engines running meant staying in spaces that were below the waterline and that would eventually fill with water. This was not a naive decision. It was a decision made by people who knew what they were doing and who had decided to keep doing it anyway. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell had been with the White Star Line for many years, had served on many ships, and had the technical knowledge to understand precisely what the flooding meant and precisely how long the power could be maintained. He organised his men into the work of keeping the machinery going, and they kept it going, and the lights stayed on and the wireless stayed powered and the pumps kept working against the flooding. An effort that could not prevent the sinking, but that could and did extend the time available for the evacuation. The pumps deserve a moment of acknowledgement. The ship's pumps were designed to remove water from compartments that had been inadvertently flooded, water that came in through a sprung plate, or through a poorly sealed fitting, or through any of the small leaks that ships develop in normal operation. They were not designed to remove water from 5 compartments that had been catastrophically punctured. The pumps ran, but against the rate of incoming water, they were essentially irrelevant. The water coming in through the hull damage was far more than the pumps could handle. They ran anyway, because keeping the pumps running was what you did, because doing nothing was worse than doing something that was not going to work. The flooding of the squash court was noted by several people who went down to look at the damage in the first hour. The squash court was on G-deck, well below the waterline even under normal conditions, and it was one of the first of the amenity spaces to flood. The image of the squash court filling with seawater, the carefully fitted walls, the lines on the floor, the equipment that had been available for the use of first-class passengers, has a quality that pure engineering description doesn't quite capture. Something had been built carefully, with attention to what it was for, and the thing it was for was now gone, replaced by something that had nothing to do with recreation or luxury, or the pleasures that wealth could arrange. The sea was simply there. In the squash court and in the mailroom and in the cargo holds and in the boiler rooms and in every other space it reached as the night progressed, the sea was there, doing what the sea does, filling the spaces available to it with the patient totality that water has, finding every opening, moving around every obstacle, rising slowly but without hesitation through the ship's interior, making the ship less a vessel and more simply a place where land and sea were negotiating the boundary between them. The negotiation was not equal. It never is. The sea always wins, eventually, against any barrier that human beings construct against it. The barriers can be very good. The steel of Titanic's hull was excellent steel. The watertight compartments were a sophisticated design. The pumps were powerful and well maintained. None of it was sufficient. All it could do was extend the negotiation, delay the outcome, buy the time that was used, however imperfectly, to lower the boats and send the wireless calls and do the other things that the extra hours made possible. Below the waterline, in the dark and the cold of the flooded compartments, the artifacts of the voyage were being preserved in the same medium that was killing the ship. The luggage in the cargo holds, the personal effects that passengers had packed for their time in New York and beyond, the objects of ordinary life that 2,000 people had brought with them across the Atlantic. These were in the water now, moving in it, settling in it, being carried in it through the ship's interior. Some of them would stay there, would go down with the ship, would settle on the ocean floor 2.5 miles below the surface. Some of them are still there, visible in the photographs taken by the remotely operated vehicles that have explored the wreck, a leather suitcase, a pair of boots, a doll. These objects are the most intimate part of what the wreck contains. The ship itself is immense and structural and historical. The objects in the debris field are personal. They belong to someone who packed them, who chose to bring them on this particular journey, who expected to unpack them again in New York or Philadelphia or New Jersey or wherever they were going. That unpacking never happened. The objects stayed in the water instead, and then on the ocean floor, and they are there now. At 12:15 in the morning, Phillips was back at the quay. Whatever he'd been doing before, the passenger messages, the backlog, the work of the evening shift, was finished now, replaced by the most important transmission of his career. The call sign he sent into the dark was CQD, which was the standard maritime distress call of the era, the letters that every wireless operator in the world knew to mean emergency, come immediately. After the call sign came MGY, which was Titanic's own identifier, the letters that placed her in the North Atlantic on this particular night. CQDMGY, CQDMGY, position 41.46 north, 50.14 west. Harold Bride suggested at some point in those early minutes that Phillips try the new signal as well, SOS, 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. The signal that was in the process of replacing CQD across international wireless practice, but had not yet fully done so. Phillips began alternating them, CQD and SOS, back and forth, into the dark, into the space between ships, into the frequency that anyone listening would be monitoring. Someone was listening, several someones in fact. The North Atlantic shipping lane was never empty, and Titanic's powerful transmitter had a range of several hundred miles. The Carpathia heard it, the Frankfurt heard it, the Olympic heard it, the Baltic heard it. Ships at various distances in various directions all received the calls, and they all responded, and the wireless room on Titanic began to fill with replies. Ships identifying themselves, asking for confirmation, calculating their positions and distances and arrival times. The news was not encouraging. The Carpathia was 58 miles away to the southeast. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, was a compact and energetic man who had a reputation for quick decisions, and his decision in this case was immediate. Turn the ship, increase speed, go. He called his chief engineer and told him he needed more knots than the Carpathia had ever made. He woke his medical staff. He had blankets and hot drinks prepared. He gave orders for every lamp on the ship to be lit so that survivors in the water would be able to see her coming from a distance. Rostron did everything right, and he was still more than 3 hours away. The Olympic was farther, 500 miles, which put her so far from the scene that she could offer only wireless support. The Frankfurt was closer but still hours away. The Baltic was hours away. Every ship that could help was too far away to help in time, with one exception that no one on Titanic knew about yet. The Californian was sitting still in the ice 10 miles away, maybe 20. The estimates vary, have varied for a century, and the exact distance has never been resolved with certainty. But she was close, closer than any other ship. Her lights, and Titanic's lights, were visible to each other. Members of the Californian's crew saw what they thought were the lights of a ship in the distance, saw those lights behave in ways that seemed unusual, and did not understand what they were seeing. But the Californian's wireless set was silent. Evans was asleep. The headphones were off. The calls going out from Phillips Key were not being received 10 miles away. At 12:25, Captain Smith gave the order to uncover the lifeboats. It was said quietly, as most of Smith's orders were said. He had a manner of command that relied on authority rather than volume, the kind of voice that people listen to because they trust it rather than because it is demanding to be listened to. The crew began moving in the organised way that crews move when they have been given a task, pulling the covers off the boats, checking the equipment, swinging the davits out over the water. The boats were beautiful pieces of equipment. 14 standard lifeboats, 2 emergency cutters, 4 collapsible canvas-sided boats, altogether enough capacity for 1,178 people, which was a bit more than half the people on the ship, but which exceeded the legal requirement for a vessel of Titanic's tonnage. This is one of the stranger facts about the disaster. Titanic was in compliance with British Board of Trade regulations. The regulations were simply wrong. They had been written for smaller ships and had not been updated as ships grew larger. Titanic had been in the water for 4 days. No lifeboat drill had been conducted. No passenger had been shown to a lifeboat station. No crew member had practiced lowering a boat in the dark in emergency conditions. The preparation for this night had not happened. It had not seemed necessary. Ships did not sink on their maiden voyages. Ships did not sink at all, really, not modern ones. Not ships with watertight compartments and Marconi equipment and experienced crews. The very conditions that made Titanic feel safe had made preparation feel redundant. Stewards went through the corridors of all three classes, knocking on doors and telling passengers to put on their life jackets and come to the boat deck. In first class, this was done with the discretion appropriate to first-class service, politely, quietly, without urgency, framed as a precaution rather than an emergency. Many passengers came out of their rooms confused and reluctant, pulling coats over their nightclothes, asking what this was about, being told it was nothing serious, just a precaution. Several went back into their rooms when they felt the ship beneath them, so solid and still, with the lights on and the heat running and no visible evidence of disaster. In second class, the response was similar. Lawrence Beasley, the science teacher who was among the most observant witnesses the disaster would produce, came out of his cabin and noticed that the ship seemed to be listing slightly. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that a level floor was no longer quite level. He put on his life jacket and went upstairs, not in panic but in the careful, curious manner of a man who is interested in what is happening to him. In third class, the situation was different in ways that mattered enormously. The stewards assigned to the third-class decks were fewer, their responsibility greater, and the language barriers between them and many of their passengers were real. A man standing in a corridor shouting instructions in English to people who spoke Swedish, or Finnish, or Lebanese Arabic or Italian was doing the best he could, and accomplishing less than the situation required. Some stewards were excellent. They guided people, used gestures, pointed towards stairs, stayed with groups. Others were overwhelmed. Others simply were not there. The gates that normally separated the third-class areas from the upper decks were another problem. The ship was designed with separation between classes as a fundamental principle, and the separations were physical, actual gates and doors that were kept locked during normal operations to prevent third-class passengers from wandering into second-class areas. In an emergency, the regulations called for these to be opened. Some were not, or were not opened quickly enough, or were opened but guarded by crew who had not been told that the emergency had progressed past the point where such distinctions mattered. The Sage family, John and Annie and their 9 children, were in the lower decks when the evacuation began. They heard the commotion in the corridor, heard the instructions, began the slow, complex process of getting 9 children dressed and moving in the right direction. They would move upward through the ship, through the increasingly tilted corridors, through the noise and confusion, through the growing evidence of something catastrophic, with Annie keeping count of her children the way she had always kept count, making sure all 9 were together, making sure no one was lost. Think about that for a moment. 9 children, the youngest 4, the tilting corridors, the noise, the doors that may or may not have been open, the darkness in some sections where the lights had already failed. Think about what a mother knows about her own children, their speeds, their fears, which one tends to lag and which one tends to run ahead, and what it costs to hold that knowledge steady in a moment like this one. The first lifeboat, Boat 7 on the starboard side, was lowered at 12:45. It had capacity for 65 people. It left the ship with 28. This was not because the other people had refused to board. It was because the evacuation had barely begun. Because the passengers who were on deck in those first minutes were not yet fully convinced that the ship was going to sink. Because the boats looked small, and the ship looked large, and the sea below looked dark and very cold. The mathematics of survival were already beginning to arrange themselves in the wrong direction. The lifeboats of Titanic were not an afterthought. They were, in fact, more than the regulations required. The British Board of Trade required ships of Titanic's tonnage to carry lifeboats for 962 people, and Titanic carried boats for 1,178. This was more than adequate by the legal standard. The legal standard was simply wrong. The regulations had been written in 1894, when ships were smaller, and when the thinking about maritime safety was organised around the assumption that ships would sink slowly, and that other ships would be nearby to assist. The North Atlantic was, in 1894, a busier and more closely monitored stretch of water than it had been even 20 years before, and the assumption of nearby assistance was not entirely unreasonable. But ships had grown. The ocean had not shrunk. The ships that were crossing the Atlantic in 1912 were 4 or 5 times the size of the ships the 1894 regulations had been written for, and the regulations had not been updated to account for this. The Titanic carried 2,224 people. Her lifeboats could accommodate 1,178. This meant that in any scenario where all the lifeboats were properly loaded and successfully launched, more than 1,000 people would be without a lifeboat seat. The designers of the ship had thought about this. The White Star Line had thought about it. The Board of Trade had thought about it. And the conclusion they had arrived at was that it was acceptable, that the combination of watertight compartments and other ships nearby would provide adequate safety without additional lifeboat capacity. The assumption of watertight compartments protecting the ship failed in 37 seconds of contact with an iceberg. The assumption of other ships nearby proved, in this instance, to be wrong in the specific. The Californian was close but silent. The other responding ships were hours away. The assumptions that had been made were not unreasonable assumptions given the information available to the people who made them. They were, as assumptions sometimes are, simply wrong. The loading of the boats was complicated by the fact that no one had practiced it. The crew had not had a lifeboat drill. The passengers had not been assigned to specific boats and had not been shown where those boats were. The officers responsible for the evacuation were working from a plan they had never rehearsed, with crew members who had never performed their specific emergency roles, in conditions that were nothing like the calm harbour conditions in which lifeboat equipment was typically tested. Officer Lightoller, who commanded the portside evacuation, later testified that he had been concerned from the moment the first boats were loaded about the davit system, the mechanical apparatus that held and lowered the boats. The Welin davits used on Titanic were a relatively new design, capable of launching more boats per davit than the older designs, which was one reason the ship could have carried more boats than she did without a major redesign. But the davits were only as useful as the crew operating them, and the crew operating them were using them for the first time in an actual emergency. The first boats went over the side slowly and somewhat clumsily, the crew members working out the procedures as they went. The boats were heavy, and lowering them 70 feet to the water in a controlled way, in the dark with people in them, required coordination between the men at the top of the davits and the men handling the lines. When it worked well, it was a clean, controlled descent. When it didn't work well, when the lines got fouled, or when the boat swung against the hull, or when the people in it panicked and shifted weight unevenly, it was something else. The number of boats that went over under capacity is one of the more damning facts of the evacuation. Boat number 1, which had a capacity of 40 people, was launched with 12. Boat number 7 went with 28 of a possible 65. Boat number 6 carried 28 out of a possible 65. These underloadings were not the result of a shortage of people wanting to board. They were the result of the reluctance of the early passengers to commit to the boats before the ship's condition was obvious, of the difficulty of getting passengers to the boats quickly enough in the early stages of the evacuation, and of officers who in some cases were not filling boats to capacity before sending them down. As the evacuation progressed and the ship's condition became more obvious, the dynamic changed. Later boats were loaded with more urgency, and some of them came close to or reached their capacity. But by then the number of available seats had been significantly reduced by the underloading of the earlier boats, and the remaining crowd on deck was growing as more passengers reached the boat deck from the lower decks. The crew members who operated the boats were themselves in a difficult position. Many of them were not sailors in the traditional sense. Stewards and cooks and other service staff had been assigned to lifeboat duties because the ship did not have enough trained seamen to crew all the boats with experienced sailors. A steward who had spent his career carrying breakfast trays and making beds was now being asked to command a ship's boat in the middle of the North Atlantic in the dark. Some of them rose to this. Others, understandably, found the task beyond what their experience had prepared them for. The argument about returning for survivors began, in some of the boats, almost immediately after they left the ship. The moral logic of going back was clear. There were people dying in the water, and the boats had room. The practical objection was less clear but felt very real to the people making it. Going back meant going into the area of debris and desperate swimmers, meant the risk of the boat being swamped by people grabbing for it from the water, meant potentially losing the boat and its current occupants in an attempt to add more. This objection was not unfounded. A ship's lifeboat in the dark, surrounded by drowning people, with untrained oarsmen and frightened passengers, was in genuine danger from the behaviour of desperate swimmers. The fear was real. The risk was real. But the boats that did not go back left room for people who died in the water, and the boats that did go back did not capsize. Fifth Officer Lowe, who went back, survived. The boat survived. The one man he pulled from the water survived. The calculation of risk had been made incorrectly by most of the people making it. There were other complications. The officers on the boat deck could not see clearly, in the dark, how many empty seats were in the boats below them. They were giving orders to load boats that they could not fully see, and the crew members in those boats were making decisions about capacity that the officers above could not monitor or correct. The communication between the deck and the boats was limited to shouting, and shouting, in the dark over the various noises of the evacuation, the engines, the escaping steam, the voices of hundreds of people, was not a reliable communication channel. The steam. One of the details that appears in many survivor accounts and that photographs do not capture is the escaping steam. The massive, deafening roar of steam being vented from the ship's boilers through the relief valves, a noise that began shortly after the collision and continued for much of the evacuation. The purpose was to prevent the boilers from building to dangerous pressure levels as the engines were shut down, but the effect on the people on deck was to make communication nearly impossible, and to add to the general quality of controlled chaos that characterized the first hour of the evacuation. The steam stopped at some point after midnight, when the boilers had cooled enough that the pressure was no longer dangerous, and the silence that followed the stopping of the steam, relative silence, the engine still running, the voices still present but the overwhelming roar gone, was itself disorienting. The ship had been making this enormous noise and now it wasn't, and the difference was almost as alarming as the noise had been. Captain Smith, according to several accounts, moved through the boat deck during the early stages of the loading, with the calm authority that had been his defining characteristic as an officer. He spoke to the crew loading the boats, observed the passengers, gave directions in the quiet manner that inspired trust. At some point in the evacuation, he picked up a megaphone and called to the crew in the water around the ship, people who had gone over the side early, telling them to swim to the boats. This detail is small and oddly specific, and it appears in at least 2 independent accounts, which suggest it is probably accurate. A man with a megaphone on the deck of a sinking ship, calling to swimmers in the water, directing them toward the boats, the ordinary operations of a captain who has not yet run out of things to do. There is a particular kind of decision that gets made in the space between knowing something is serious and believing it is fatal. On the boat deck of Titanic in the hour after midnight, that space was enormous. The ship was sinking. The officers knew it. Thomas Andrews knew it. A handful of crew members had figured it out. But for most of the 2,000 people aboard, the information had not yet arrived in the form required to produce action. The ship looked fine. This is the strange thing. The thing that makes the evacuation account so difficult to read. The ship looked, from the boat deck, completely normal. The lights were on. The engines were still producing enough power to keep the lights on and the heat running. The deck was level enough that a person standing on it did not feel in immediate danger. And the lifeboats, the small wooden boats hanging in the davits, creaking slightly as the ship moved, looked very much worse than the ship they were supposed to replace. Benjamin Guggenheim came up from his cabin in his dressing gown and life jacket, one of the first prominent first-class passengers to appear on deck. He spoke to a steward, went back to his room, returned sometime later in evening dress, white tie, dinner jacket, the clothes he would have worn to the finest restaurant in New York. His valet, Victor Giglio, was similarly dressed. When asked why they had changed, Guggenheim is reported to have said that they had decided to go down as gentlemen. Whether he believed death was certain in that moment, or whether the phrase was a performance of composure intended for the benefit of those around him, is impossible to know. What is certain is that he and Giglio then spent the following hour helping women and children toward the lifeboats, lifting children into boats, guiding women through the dark, doing the work that needed doing. John Jacob Astor helped his young wife Madeline into Lifeboat 4. She was visibly pregnant, and he asked the loading officer, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, if he might accompany her given her condition. Lightoller said no. No men while there were women and children still on deck. Astor accepted this. He stepped back. He kissed his wife. He told her he would follow on another boat. The boat was lowered, and Madeline descended toward the water, and Asta remained on the deck of the ship. It was the last time they would see each other. Madeline survived. Their son was born in August. Lightoller was enforcing the women and children first rule strictly, which was one interpretation of the instruction he had received. On the other side of the ship, First Officer Murdoch was enforcing it differently. Women and children first, but men could board if there were empty seats and no women waiting. The difference between these two interpretations would matter enormously across the next 2 hours. Boats on Murdoch's side left with more people, boats on Lightoller's side left with fewer. The total capacity of the boats was fixed either way, but the utilization of that capacity varied by interpretation, by the side of the ship, by the specific officer in charge of each boat. Isidore and Ida Strowl appeared on deck together. They had been together for 40 years, and they moved together now, arm in arm, watching the boats fill and be lowered. At some point, a crew member offered Ida a place in a lifeboat, and she went toward it, and then she stopped. She turned back to her husband. He was not allowed in the boat. He was not a woman, not a child, not injured. The rule was the rule. Ida looked at the boat, and then she looked at her husband, and she stepped back. "Where you go, I go," she told him. "We have lived together for so long. Where you go, I go." They were seen later on deck chairs, side by side, wrapped in blankets, holding hands. This is one of the images that the Titanic disaster bequeathed to history. Two old people sitting together in the cold, waiting for what was coming, choosing not to be separated by it. There is nothing to say about this that the image doesn't say for itself. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia was in his cabin when his wireless operator woke him. He came out of sleep quickly, took in what was being told to him, made his decision in seconds. Turn the ship, full speed, go. He gave his orders, and then he went to the bridge and stood there for the 3.5 hours it would take to cover 58 miles, watching the dark ahead, willing his ship faster. He had the Carpathia's engines pushed past their designed maximum. He had every available stoker called to the boiler rooms. He had the ship's passengers, who were woken and told what was happening, moved to make room for survivors. He prepared for everything he could prepare for, and then he drove his ship through the dark as fast as she could go. He was still more than 3 hours away. On the Californian, Officer Herbert Stone was on watch. He could see lights in the distance, the lights of a ship sitting low on the horizon, roughly 10 miles away. He'd been watching them for a while. They had seemed odd to him, the lights of this distant ship. They seemed to be in a position that was slightly wrong, tilted, not quite horizontal. And then he saw something else, a flash of light in the sky above the distant ship, white and brief and apparently coming from the ship itself. Stone watched another flash, and then another. He called down to the chart room where the Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, was sleeping. Stone told Lord that the ship in the distance was firing rockets. Lord, still half asleep, asked Stone what colour they were. Stone said they appeared to be white. Lord, apparently without fully waking, suggested it might be company signals, the practice some shipping lines had of using private rocket signals to communicate between their own vessels. He told Stone to keep watching and to let him know if anything changed. Stone kept watching. More rockets went up from the distant ship. He would count 8 of them before they stopped. He reported each one to Lord, and each time Lord acknowledged and went back to sleep. Stone did not wake Lord more forcefully. He did not call the wireless operator. He did not act on what he was seeing in any way that would have made a difference. He watched the rockets, he reported them, and he stood his watch as the distant lights slowly changed their position and then disappeared. What were rockets fired from a ship at midnight, over open water, supposed to mean? In 1912, as in 2024, the answer was distress. Everyone who saw them knew what they meant. Stone knew. The other crew members on watch who glimpsed them knew. Captain Lord, when he was asked about it later, said that he had not been convinced that they were distress rockets, that company signals used rockets too, that nothing was certain in the dark. His defenders have repeated this argument for a century. His critics have pointed out that ships do not fire 8 white rockets at midnight in the North Atlantic for any reason other than emergency. The history of the disaster is full of moments where a different choice would have changed everything, and this is perhaps the most significant of them. If the Californian had gotten underway when Stone first reported the rockets, she might have reached the Titanic within an hour. The ship was still afloat then. There were still hundreds of people on deck who could have been taken aboard. The boats would not have been necessary to the extent they were, but the choice was not made, and the rockets went on rising into the sky above the stricken ship, and the Californian sat still in the ice. In the wireless room Phillips kept sending. His signals were going out in all directions, into the dark, into the frequency that anyone nearby should have been monitoring. He was transmitting the ship's position. He was responding to the ships that were answering. He was doing the last valuable thing that could be done in a room that was beginning, incrementally, to feel the slope of the deck as the bow sank lower. Did he know he was going to die? He must have known the ship was sinking. He must have understood from the information available to him that the ships which had responded were not close enough to save everyone. Whether he allowed himself to pursue that mathematics to its conclusion, whether he thought about his own position in it, this is unknowable. What is known is that he stayed at the key. The signals kept going out, and the water below was rising. The survivors of Titanic spent the rest of their lives trying to describe it. Some tried once in the immediate weeks after the disaster, and then stopped speaking of it publicly. Some wrote books, some gave lectures, some answered questions for decades, at memorials and conventions and interviews, trying to convey to people who had not been there the texture of something that their listeners could approach only from the outside. The difficulty is obvious. The experience of being on a sinking ship at midnight in the North Atlantic is not an experience that most people have any frame of reference for, and the accounts of it, the best of them, the most carefully crafted, keep running into the edges of language. The cold is cold, the dark is dark, the ship is enormous and then gone. Words approach these things and fall a little short, the way words fall short of most experiences that are fully physical, that live in the body rather than in the mind. What the survivor accounts convey most powerfully, perhaps, is not the physical experience but the internal one, the sequence of understanding, the way the mind moved from ignorance to awareness, to comprehension, to something that had no name, the progression through states of knowledge that were each, in their moment, the most terrible thing that had happened yet. Everhart was 7 years old and travelling in second class with her parents. Her mother, suspicious of ships, had decided before the voyage that she would not sleep at night, but would stay awake and watch, a precaution that her family found amusing, and that turned out to be the decision that saved Eva's life, because when the ship struck the iceberg her mother was awake and alert, and got them to the boat deck quickly, early enough to find places in a lifeboat. Eva's father did not survive. She spent the rest of her life. She died in 1996 at 83, as an outspoken advocate for maritime safety, appearing in documentaries and giving interviews and refusing to allow the conversation about the disaster to become sentimental or comfortable. She once said that what she remembered most from the water, from the lifeboat, from the time between the ship going down and the Carpathia arriving, was the silence that replaced the sound of the people in the water. The sound had been terrible. The silence that followed was worse. This is perhaps the most precise description of the disaster's final hour that any survivor left behind. Colonel Archibald Gracie was 53, a military man and an amateur historian who had been working before the disaster on a history of the Battle of Chickamauga. He survived by clinging to an overturned collapsible lifeboat with Second Officer Lightoller and about 30 other men. He spent the night in the water up to his waist, shifting his weight when Lightoller called, watching the sky for the dawn that would mean rescue was possible. The cold did something to him that his body never fully recovered from. He died in December of 1912, 8 months after the disaster, and the book he'd been writing about it was published posthumously, completed enough to be understood. His account is notable for its precision. He had an officer's instinct for observation and timing, and he reconstructed the events of the night with a level of detail that went beyond what most survivors provided. He had interviewed other survivors on the Carpathia while the events were still immediate, had compared their accounts, had tried to build something like a composite picture of what had happened where and when. The effort was immense and the result was valuable, and it cost him whatever remained of his physical health. Charlotte Collier was travelling in second class with her husband Harvey and their daughter Marjorie, 10 years old. They were emigrating to Idaho, where Harvey had already purchased a farm, sight unseen, based on descriptions he had read in an immigration pamphlet. Charlotte and Marjorie survived. Harvey did not. In the years after the disaster, Charlotte wrote about what it had been like to look back from the lifeboat and watch the ship go down, to watch it take her husband with it, to not be able to do anything about any of this. She described Harvey handing Marjorie into the lifeboat, the child crying and clutching at him, and Harvey saying something to her that Charlotte couldn't hear from where she stood, and then Marjorie being lowered in the boat and Harvey stepping back and the boat going down and Harvey getting smaller as they descended. This is the kind of detail that survivor accounts contain that makes the disaster real in a way that statistics cannot. The specific image, the specific action, the way distance works on the human face. Ruth Becker was 12 and travelling in second class with her mother and her younger siblings. Her account, given in interviews conducted when she was in her 60s and 70s, had the quality of something preserved carefully over many decades, detailed and specific and emotionally measured, the account of someone who had spent a long time learning how to carry an experience without being broken by it. She remembered the cold, she remembered the sounds, she remembered the lifeboat and the waiting, and the Carpathia appearing on the horizon, and the feeling that moved through the people in the boat when they saw the rescue ship's lights. There were survivors who never spoke about it. This is documented, the people who survived and then declined, sometimes for their entire subsequent lives, to give interviews or write accounts or attend commemorations. Some of them had survived in circumstances they did not want examined, men who had been in lifeboats that could have taken more people, or who had survived in ways that the survivor's guilt found uncomfortable to dwell on. Some of them were simply people for whom the private management of the experience was more viable than the public recounting of it. The survivor's guilt was real and lasted. This has been documented in the accounts of the people who spoke about it, the persistent question of why they were alive when others were not, the absence of any satisfying answer to that question, the way the question returned in the quiet moments and in dreams and in the sight of anything that reminded them of the night. Some survivors refused to travel by ship again, some had nightmares for decades, some reported that the cold of certain nights, cold of a particular quality, clear and still and very dark, brought it back with a completeness that other triggers did not. Jack Thayer was 17 and had jumped from the ship into the water and survived on Collapsible B. He gave detailed accounts of what he had seen from the water, the ship's final moments, the angle, the lights, the sound of the breakup. He drew sketches from memory that were accurate enough to be used by engineers. He grew up and went to university and had a career and a family, and he lived with what he had seen until 1945, when his son was killed in the Pacific and the loss broke something that had been holding. His account of the night, written in 1940, is among the most vivid and precise of all the survivor testimonies. He was 31 years older than he had been on the lifeboat, but in the account he was 17 again, in the water, watching the ship come apart above him. These are the people the disaster left behind, the 710 who came off the Carpathia in New York and then had to figure out what to do with what they carried. They were not, for the most part, the famous ones. They were the ordinary ones. The teacher and the farmer's wife and the 12-year-old girl and the 17-year-old boy, and the woman from County Cork who had been on her way to relatives in New Jersey. They had to eat breakfast on April the 19th and walk on the streets of New York and write letters home and explain what had happened, and find out where they were going to sleep and begin, slowly, the work of constructing a life in the aftermath of a disaster. The world received them with a mixture of relief and voyeurism that is perhaps inevitable when large-scale tragedy produces survivors. The newspapers wanted interviews, the families wanted accounts, the investigators wanted testimony, everyone wanted to know what it had been like, and the survivors were the only ones who could say, and saying it over and over did not, for most of them, make it any easier to carry. Some of them found over years and decades that talking about it helped, that the act of putting the experience into words, of sharing it with people who were genuinely trying to understand, did something useful. Others found that it did the opposite, that every retelling refreshed the images rather than fading them. These are recognizable experiences. They are the experiences of anyone who has survived something that should not have been survived, who has to continue living in the shadow of an event that should have been fatal and was not. The Titanic survivors were among the most extensively documented people in this position in history, but the position itself is not unusual. It is simply human. What is perhaps unusual is the degree to which the world continued to be interested in their experience for so long enough that the last survivor, Milvina Dean, was still being asked about a night she could not remember, a night she had been 9 weeks old for, decades after the people who could actually remember it were gone. The event had become larger than its survivors. It had become, somehow, the property of everyone who needed a story about what happens when human ambition meets what the world actually contains. Wallace Hartley assembled his musicians on the boat deck sometime after 1 in the morning. He was the band leader, 33 years old, from Colne in Lancashire, a careful and serious musician with a reputation for being able to read a room and give it what it needed. He had spent the voyage playing for the first-class passengers in the lounge, 2 sessions daily, the kind of elegant background music that wealthy people of 1912 expected and appreciated without particularly attending to it. His 8 musicians were good. They had built their repertoire over the past 4 days and had the easy familiarity of professional performers who have played together long enough to communicate without speaking. They did not have to be there. They were employees of the Marconi Company, technically, or of the agency that supplied musicians to shipping lines, and their employment did not include standing on a sinking ship in the dark and playing music, so that people would feel less afraid. No document required this of them. No officer ordered them to it. They went out because Hartley went, and Hartley went because he understood, without needing it explained, that what was happening on that deck required something that his particular skill could provide. They started with ragtime. This is one of the details that has always struck me about the accounts of this night, that the first music the band played in the face of disaster was ragtime, the popular syncopated dance music of the era, music designed for movement and lightness and cheerful energy. It would seem incongruous, even absurd if you tried to design it from the outside, but from the inside, in the moment, it was exactly right. It said to the people on deck that the situation was not yet past the point where ordinary human life was possible, that there was still a version of this night in which people could be cheerful, in which the normal responses to music were still available. As the hour progressed and the ship's angle became more noticeable, as the boats were lowered one by one and the remaining crowd on deck grew smaller, and the evidence of disaster became harder to avoid, the music changed. The band moved from ragtime to popular songs to hymns to the slower and more contemplative kind of music that speaks to people who have understood what is happening to them. They played, by various accounts, for more than 2 hours. They played until the deck was tilted enough that playing required active effort, until some of them were struggling to maintain their footing, until the moment came when there was nothing more to play. What did it feel like to be one of those 8 men? What went through Hartley's mind as he watched the boats descend and did not take a place in any of them? He was not forced to stay. No one held him there. He stayed because the music was doing something, was providing something, and because stopping would have meant acknowledging that the thing music could do had reached its limit. As long as the instruments were making sound, there was still a framework, still a form that the night was taking that was recognizable as human, as something other than chaos. The passengers who remain in the accounts of this hour are the ones who had either chosen to stay or found themselves unable to reach the boats. Some had stayed for the reasons we have already seen: the elderly, the devoted couples who would not be separated, the people who had arrived too late and found the boats already gone. Some were third-class passengers who had been navigating the ship's complex interior in the dark and had come up to the boat deck only to find it nearly empty of boats. Father Thomas Biles was a Catholic priest travelling in second class, on his way to officiate at a wedding in New York. He had spent the voyage visiting the third-class passengers, saying masses for them in the general room, being by all accounts the kind of priest who exists in every religious tradition, the person who shows up where the need is, regardless of what the schedule says. On the night of April the 15th, he showed up on the lower decks with the people who were trapped there, hearing confessions, giving absolution, praying with people in multiple languages, moving from person to person with the specific kind of steadiness that comes from having organised one's life around the question of what matters most. He was offered a lifeboat seat twice and declined it twice. He stayed below with the people who could not leave. Thomas Andrews moved through the ship throughout the evacuation. He had put on a life jacket and then taken it off again, a detail that has always seemed significant to those who have written about him, although what exactly it means is uncertain. He was seen in every part of the ship, appearing in accounts with a kind of calm ubiquity, in the engine rooms and in the first-class corridors and on the boat deck and below it, always moving, always with someone, always doing something practical, directing passengers towards stairs, checking flooding levels, speaking to crew members about the state of various compartments. One account places him, in the final hour, standing in the first-class smoking room looking at a painting. The painting was a harbour scene, which seems either random or unbearably appropriate depending on how you look at it. He was not in his life jacket. He was not moving. He was simply standing looking at the painting in a room that was emptying of everything else. Whether this was the moment in which the builder of the ship had finally allowed himself to feel what was happening to his creation, whether this was grief or prayer or simply exhaustion, the account does not say. It only records that he was there. Wherever you are right now, whatever room you are in, notice it for a moment. Notice the ceiling above you and the floor beneath you. Notice the particular quality of quiet in this hour. Humans have been building shelters for 40,000 years, building them more and more carefully, making them more solid and more safe, and each one of them is also an act of love toward the people who will live inside it. Thomas Andrews had made something magnificent. The fact that it was going was not nothing, even in the larger accounting of all the other things that were going. On the boat deck, with the band playing and the boats going down, there were moments of extraordinary ordinary human behaviour. A young man helped an elderly woman he had never met find her way to a boat. A steward who was terrified of the water and could not swim stayed at his post because leaving felt wrong. A father found his daughter separated from him in the crowd and held her hand all the way up the tilting stairs, not speaking, just holding on. The history of disaster is always, underneath its specific details, a history of what people do when the ordinary rules of life are suspended, when the future has become very short and the calculations that normally govern behaviour have to be made very quickly. Most people, most of the time, in most disasters, do not behave as the movies suggest. They do not panic first and think later. They try to understand what is happening. They look for people they know. They help when they can help. They make choices that are sometimes selfish and sometimes extraordinary, and most often simply human, shaped by fear and love and habit and the particular circumstances of who they are and where they find themselves at the moment the ordinary world ends. The band played on, the deck tilted, the stars were still out. There were no clouds on the night of April the 15th, 1912. The sky above the Atlantic was perfectly clear, which was one of the reasons the iceberg had not been spotted sooner, which was one of the reasons the temperature had dropped so sharply, which was one of the reasons the sea was so calm that there was no foam against the iceberg's base to make it visible. The same perfect conditions that made the night beautiful were the conditions that killed the ship. This is the kind of thing that is hard to hold in the mind, that beauty and catastrophe can be the same thing, that the stars overhead were gorgeous and lethal, that the calm of the sea was a mirror that showed nothing useful. The world is not organised around our comfort or our survival. It only contains them sometimes. Tonight it contained the band, and the stars, and the slowly tilting deck, and the music that played into the cold air over the flat and indifferent Atlantic. History tends to thin its people out. The further back you go, the fewer the details that survive about any individual life, until at some point you are left with only a name and a date, and perhaps a profession, and the person behind those things is largely gone. The Titanic disaster is unusual in the richness of documentation that surrounds it. The inquiries, the survivor accounts, the letters and diaries that were recovered, the photographs, the passenger manifest with its extraordinary specificity of detail. You can know, if you look carefully, not just that someone was aboard, but what they were doing there, where they had come from, what they were moving toward. William Thomas Stead was 63 years old, a British journalist who had spent his career making powerful people uncomfortable by publishing things they would have preferred kept quiet. He had written about child prostitution in London, when child prostitution in London was something that powerful people preferred not to have written about, and the resulting outcry had changed the law. He had written about naval policy and foreign policy, and the treatment of prisoners and a dozen other subjects where the official position was wrong, and the public interest was served by saying so. He was travelling to New York to address a peace conference at Carnegie Hall. Stead had written, years before the disaster, a fictional piece about a ship that sank in the Atlantic with insufficient lifeboats. He had also written another piece, some years later, about a White Star liner that was rammed by an iceberg and sank with enormous loss of life. These pieces circulated after the disaster as evidence of premonition, or of Stead's prophetic quality, or of the general way that certain themes recur in the imagination of people who spend their lives paying attention to the world. More likely, they were evidence of a careful observer's awareness that the North Atlantic shipping lanes were dangerous in specific ways that the industry was not taking seriously enough. Stead did not survive. He was last seen helping women into lifeboats with the same energy and directness that had characterized his journalism. He was a man accustomed to doing what needed doing regardless of whether it was comfortable, and this, in his final hours, was what needed doing. Henry Sleeper Harper was travelling in first class with his wife Myra, and his Egyptian dragoman, a guide and translator, named Hamad Hassab, and a Pekingese dog named Sun Yat-sen. Harper was an heir to the Harper publishing house that bore his family name, and he was accustomed to travel and to the arrangement of his circumstances according to his preferences. He survived, and his account of the night included a detail that no other survivor provided. From his lifeboat, he watched Titanic go down while a man he didn't know stood beside him in the boat smoking a cigar with perfect composure. The cigar detail has always seemed quintessentially right for the era. Someone facing the end of the world's largest ship in the dark cold Atlantic in a small boat, and a man beside him smoking a cigar. Edith Russell was a fashion correspondent travelling with her professional equipment, her samples and her notes, and, reportedly, a small musical toy pig that she carried as a lucky charm and that she used as a flotation device to attract attention from a lifeboat, holding it up and winding it to make it play music. She was picked up from the water holding the pig. She survived into her 90s, was known for decades as one of the most colourful of the Titanic survivors, appeared in interviews with the pig until very late in her life, and died in 1975 at what she claimed was 98, though her actual age was disputed. Arthur Pushen was a Canadian Army major and an experienced sailor, one of the few passengers with actual sailing experience. He was called on to help crew one of the lifeboats, and he proved useful in this capacity. He survived. He spent the rest of his life being quietly criticised for surviving, in the way that male survivors sometimes were. The assumption that if you were a man who had survived, you had done something questionable to accomplish it, regardless of the circumstances. Pushen's circumstances were, in fact, entirely legitimate. He had been called on specifically for his sailing skills and asked to take a place in a boat. But the assumption sat on him anyway, in the way assumptions of this kind do. Charles Jowin was the chief baker of the Titanic. He spent the hours of the evacuation distributing bread from the ship's bakeries to the lifeboats as they were loaded, and then he spent some time drinking whiskey, by his own account, in his cabin. He reached the stern of the ship as it went under and was in the water for some time, a longer time than most people survived, and he attributed his survival to the insulating effect of the alcohol. This theory has been argued over by physiologists. What is certain is that Jowin reached the upturned collapsible B and eventually the Carpathia, and that his account of the night is one of the more remarkable in its specificity and its unusual trajectory through the disaster. The second and third class survivors were fewer in number and received less immediate attention in the press and the inquiries, but they were the larger part of the surviving community, and their stories, taken together, provide a picture of the disaster from the inside of the ship rather than from its public spaces. The immigrant experience of the disaster, the language barriers, the locked gates, the confusion in the corridors, the way the ship's design both protected and endangered different classes of passenger, is documented in their accounts in ways that the first-class accounts do not provide. Anna Sjöblom was 18 and travelling from Finland to Chicago, where she had a brother who had emigrated years earlier and who had written home about the possibilities available to someone willing to work hard. She survived by reaching the boat deck and finding a place in a boat. Her account of the evacuation described the locked gate that she had encountered in the corridor, the Swedish passengers who helped each other find ways around it or through it, the sound of the ship's structure as she moved upward through it. She arrived in Chicago and she worked hard and she lived a long life, and the locked gate stayed in her memory as the thing that had almost stopped her reaching the boat deck, as the thing that had certainly stopped some of the people she'd been moving with in that corridor. Daniel Buckley was a young Irishman from County Cork, 21 years old, travelling in third class to New York where he planned to find work in construction. He survived by, among other things, being covered by a shawl by a first-class woman when an officer came through the boat trying to remove men who had snuck aboard. The story is one of the more human details of the disaster, a woman covering a frightened young man with her shawl so that he would not be noticed by an officer who might have put him off the boat. kindness and improvisation, and the natural human inclination to protect someone near you. The musicians. We should spend a moment more with the musicians because their story is not complete in the first telling. All 8 of them were from the same labour pool, musicians contracted to the shipping lines through an agency, a common arrangement in 1912. They were not employees of the White Star Line in any formal sense, which meant that when the ship sank they were in a somewhat anomalous position. People who had been providing a service and whose contract said nothing about what they should do when the ship was going down. Wallace Hartley was the leader, and his leadership in the final hours was of a piece with his character as described by everyone who knew him. He was not a dramatic man. He was a careful, professional musician with a Methodist faith that seemed to provide him with an orientation toward difficulty that was neither theatrical nor passive, but practical. He assembled his musicians. He directed them. He kept them playing. John Wesley Woodward played the cello. Roger Bricoux played the cello as well. 2 cellists on a ship's band, which was unusual. Percy Taylor played the piano in the first-class lounge, but was on deck with a different instrument when the band assembled in the final hour. Georges Crin was Belgian. Jock Hume was Scottish, and had written to his father about the voyage in terms that suggested he was proud of the posting. All of them had their particular lives, their families, their professional histories, their private concerns. All of them went down with the ship that they refused to leave until the ship made leaving impossible. The memorial for the Titanic musicians that stands in Southampton does not say much about why they stayed. It lists their names and notes that they died performing their duty. This is accurate as far as it goes, but it doesn't quite reach the thing that is interesting about their choice, which is that the duty did not require them to stay, that they stayed anyway, that they played for 2 hours on a deck that was tilting under them, because they understood, without it being said, that the music was doing something that needed doing. What the music was doing was making it possible for the night to have a form. In situations of extreme chaos and danger, the presence of something organised, something that follows rules, that proceeds according to a logic, that has a structure you can follow and that does not panic, provides a kind of anchor for the people around it. The music was organised, it followed rules, it proceeded calmly, and this told the people near enough to hear it, in a register below language, that the situation had not yet moved entirely outside the range of human management. When the music stopped, it stopped because the musicians themselves could no longer stand. Not because they chose to stop, but because the deck took the choice away from them. This is the version of events most consistent with the survivor accounts. And this too is a kind of testimony to the persistence of the human impulse to make something in the face of what is coming, to keep making it until the making is no longer possible. The statistics of the Titanic disaster are well known and they are blunt. Of the passengers in first class, 62% survived. Of the passengers in second class, 41% survived. Of the passengers in third class, 24% survived. Of the crew, 24% survived. These numbers are sometimes cited as evidence of deliberate discrimination, and sometimes defended as the inevitable result of physical geography. Third class was deep in the ship, and the boat deck was high above it. And the truth, as it usually is more complicated than either simple explanation allows. Third class was deep in the ship. That is a fact. The labyrinthine corridors of the lower decks, the staircases that did not connect directly to the upper levels, the locked gates between class sections. These were physical obstacles that existed independent of anyone's intention on the night of April the 15th. Getting from third class to the boat deck required navigating a ship that many passengers had been aboard for only 4 days, in the dark, with the corridors at an increasing angle, with other people moving in different directions and making different sounds, with the sounds of the ship's structure under stress growing louder as the night progressed. But the geography alone does not account for everything. Some of the gates were locked when they should have been opened. Some crew members stayed at their posts maintaining class separations, when the situation had long since moved past the point where class mattered. Some stewards who were supposed to guide third-class passengers upward had abandoned the task, had decided to look to their own survival, had moved toward the boats without the people they were responsible for. This happened. It is documented in the testimony of survivors. Some crew members did exactly the right thing, did it correctly and immediately and at cost to themselves. The accounts of third-class survivors include officers and stewards who opened the gates as soon as the evacuation began, who guided groups of passengers through the unfamiliar corridors, who stayed with them all the way to the boat deck. These people existed too. The situation does not divide neatly into heroes and villains, only into people doing better and worse, under conditions for which none of them had been prepared. The Sage family reached the boat deck late. By the time all 9 children had been gathered and dressed and moved upward through the ship, most of the boats had already been launched. John Sage, the father, had gone ahead to assess the situation and came back to find his family. Annie Sage had kept count of all 9 children through the corridors, up the stairs, through the noise. They arrived on deck together and found almost nothing left. There are no survivors from the Sage family. All 11 of them, John and Annie and their 9 children ranging in age from 4 to 20, were lost. What happened in their last hours is not recorded in any account that has survived. They were together. That is the only thing that can be said with confidence. They were together at the end, and together is perhaps the only consolation available in a night that offered very few. Eugene Daly did survive. He reached the boat deck with his woolen pipes, found the situation there chaotic and the boats mostly gone, and at some point made the decision to enter the water. This is not a small decision. The North Atlantic in April is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, not much above freezing, cold enough to cause incapacitation within minutes, and death within half an hour for most people. Daly apparently grabbed some floating wreckage and then managed to pull himself into a lifeboat that had been swamped and was drifting. He made it to the Carpathia. He survived, though several accounts suggest he was traumatized in ways that persisted for years, that he rarely spoke about that night, that the pipes he had carried so carefully aboard the ship went down with it. The experience of the immigrants in third class is one of the aspects of the disaster that took the longest to receive proper historical attention. The famous names in first class dominated the early accounts. Astor, Guggenheim, Strauss, the great industrial figures of the Gilded Age. The immigrant families took longer to recover from the documentary record because their documents were fewer and their families were in places where no one was writing the history. The Lebanese passengers are a good example. There was a significant group of Lebanese immigrants, referred to in the records of 1912 as Syrians, since Lebanon was then part of the Ottoman province of Syria, travelling in third class, many of them from the same villages, connected by the dense networks of kinship and community that characterise immigrant travel of this period. They were moving toward established Lebanese communities in the United States, communities that had been building since the 1880s and that sent back news of possibilities, of money that could be made, of a life that was different from the one available at home. Several of them survived, and their accounts, gathered by researchers working decades later, describe the confusion below decks, the noise and the dark and the tilting corridors, and the difficulty of understanding what the crew members were telling them. They helped each other navigate. They moved in groups because groups move better than individuals in uncertain territory. Some of them made it, some of them did not. This is the texture of the disaster in its middle hours, not the famous scenes that have been depicted in films, not the grand gestures of the wealthy, but the dozens of smaller stories happening simultaneously in the dark interior of the ship, in the corridors and compartments and stairwells, as people tried to find their way toward the open air and toward whatever chance existed up there on the tilted deck. The ship was groaning. This is something the accounts mention that the films tend to underplay, the sound that a large steel structure makes when it is under the kind of stress that Titanic was under. As the bow filled with water and sank lower, and as the stern correspondingly began to rise out of the water, the steel of the ship was being bent, slowly but constantly, and steel under bending stress makes a sound. A low, resonant groan, something between a moan and a creak, felt in the feet as much as heard with the ears, a sound that the hull produced constantly in these hours like an animal that knows what is happening to it. Above the sound of the engines, which were still running, still producing power for the lights, and above the sound of the people on deck and above the band playing its hymns into the dark, was this deeper sound, this sound the ship itself was making. Experienced sailors understood it immediately. Most passengers did not, but they felt it nevertheless, the way you sometimes feel a sound as a physical sensation before your brain has identified it as sound. The time was moving toward 1:30 in the morning. The ship's bow was noticeably lower. The angle of the deck was obvious enough now that standing required adjustment, that loose objects had begun to slide toward the forward end of whatever surface they rested on. Deck chairs moved. Dishes had already slid from tables in the dining rooms below. Water was audible in some of the corridors. Not visible yet, not reaching the passenger areas, but present, making it sound through the walls of the ship. And still, the lights were on. The engineers in the boiler rooms and engine rooms were keeping them on, were maintaining the power that allowed the wireless to function and the lights to burn and the pumps to attempt their impossible work against the flooding. These men, Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his team of men below decks, dozens of them, had been at their station since the collision and had been told at some point that the ship was sinking. They stayed anyway. They stayed and they kept the machines running and none of them survived. What does it mean to be told the ship is sinking and to stay at your post? To understand that the water is coming and that when it reaches you there will be no way out, and to keep doing your work anyway. These are the men whose names appear in the smallest type in the memorials, the men whose service was structural rather than visible, the ones who made possible every lifeboat that was lowered, every message that was sent, every minute that the operation lasted, and who received no benefit from any of it themselves. The light stayed on, until very near the end the light stayed on. That is their story. If you're still drifting with me through this dark Atlantic night, let yourself go a little deeper now. Subscribe if this story has found you in the right hour, so the next one is waiting when you return. There are more stories where this one came from, and they will be here. By 1:30 in the morning, the last of the regular wooden lifeboats were being loaded. The evacuation that had begun with passengers reluctant to leave a seemingly solid ship had transformed, in the space of 90 minutes, into an evacuation in which the remaining passengers understood with great clarity that the ship was going and that their only chance lay in the boats. The reluctance had become urgency, but the boats were almost gone. Lifeboat 14 was lowered under the command of Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, one of the younger officers, but also one of the most forceful. He was Welsh, and he had a directness that had already made him notable during the loading. He had fired a pistol along the hull of the ship between the boat and the ship to clear away men who had been trying to crowd aboard. The shots were not aimed at anyone. They were meant to create space, to enforce the loading order, to prevent the boat from being swamped by people climbing in from above. They had the intended effect. Lowe was also the only officer who, after his boat reached the water, organised a proper rescue attempt. He waited until he judged that the people in the water, he could still hear them at this point, their voices carrying across the cold flat water, had reached the point where their movements had slowed. He transferred some of his passengers to other boats to make room. He rowed back toward the place where the ship had been. He pulled one man alive from the water. By the time he arrived, most of the others had already gone quiet. Margaret Brown was in Lifeboat 6, which had been lowered under the command of Quartermaster Robert Hitchens. Hitchens was one of the account's less admirable figures, frightened, certain that any attempt to return to the wreck would result in the swamping of the boat, resistant to any plan that involved additional risk. Brown had been trying to convince him to go back for survivors, almost from the moment the boat touched the water. She was not a woman who accepted limitations gracefully, and the limitation of sitting in a half-empty lifeboat while people drowned a few hundred yards away was one she found intolerable. The argument between Brown and Hitchens continued for most of the night. She eventually took partial control of the boat's operation, not through any authority she had, but through the force of her personality, the directness of her attention, the simple fact that she was willing to do things and he was not. She helped row. She organised the other passengers. She kept people from giving in to the cold and the despair that the cold encourages. The boat number 6 carried 28 people to the Carpathia, all alive. The collapsible boats, 4 canvas-sided boats that could be collapsed for storage, were the last hope. They were kept on top of the officers' quarters and required considerable work to launch. 2 of them, C and D, were successfully deployed from the davits. C went with 39 people, including J. Bruce Ismay, who stepped into the boat as it was loading. There were no women waiting. There was space in the boat. Ismay took the space. He would spend the rest of his life trying to explain this, and the explanation would never quite satisfy anyone. And he would withdraw from public life almost entirely in the years that followed. And the satisfaction of his critics would not have comforted him, because by any accounting he knew what it meant to be in the boat while others were not. Collapsible D was lowered at approximately 2:15, with only 20 people aboard, including 2 small children, the Navratil boys, Michel and Edmond, 4 and 2 years old respectively, travelling under assumed names because their father had taken them from their mother in France without her knowledge or permission. Their father, who called himself Louis Hoffmann, helped load children and women into the boats, and then stood on the deck as his sons descended. He did not survive. The boys arrived in New York speaking only French, and their photograph appeared in newspapers, and their mother, who had been searching for them since they disappeared, recognized them and came to claim them. This is the closest thing to a happy ending the night produced. The 2 remaining collapsibles, A and B, could not be properly launched. The ship's angle was now severe enough that normal launching procedures were impossible. The crew attempted to manhandle them off the roof of the officers' quarters and onto the deck, which required lifting and dragging enormously heavy objects on an increasingly tilted surface, with the knowledge that the ship might not stay above water long enough to complete the task. Collapsible. A slid off the ship's side right side up but was immediately partially swamped. It drifted away from the sinking ship with perhaps 20 people clinging to it or in it, partially submerged, offering refuge of a kind, not safety but a slightly better option than open water. Collapsible B went over the side upside down and floated, hull up, in the water near the ship. Approximately 30 men managed to climb onto its upturned bottom. Second Officer Lightoller, wireless operator Harold Bride and others, and spent the following hours standing on the upturned hull in the dark, shifting their weight in unison at Lightoller's direction, to keep the hull from rolling, their feet in the water, the Atlantic cold rising through their shoes. Lightoller's command of that upturned boat is one of the more remarkable feats of the night. He organised the men into 2 lines and had them lean in the direction he called, keeping the boat balanced against the movement of the water. He kept count of who was on the hull. He watched for lights. He was methodical and calm, and it was entirely his calmness and methodology that kept the boat from capsizing and the men on it from dying in the water. This is sometimes what leadership looks like. Not dramatic, not inspiring, not the stuff of speeches, just the steady application of skill and attention in a situation where those are the most valuable things available. Captain Smith walked through the ship in the final half hour. He appeared to crew members and passengers at various points, speaking to them, releasing them from their posts, telling them to save themselves. This was not an instruction that his officers could all follow. Lightoller stayed. Murdoch stayed. Various crew members stayed at their stations or near the remaining boats, until there were no more stations to keep and no more boats to man. Smith himself was last reliably seen on the bridge as the water came up the forward deck toward it. Some accounts say he went into the water from the bridge as it submerged. Others say he went down with the bridge itself. What is certain is that he did not survive, and that whatever he was feeling in those last minutes, he kept it to himself. The first-class smoking room was empty except for Thomas Andrews. A steward named John Stewart passed the door and looked in and saw him there, standing before the painting, not moving, his life jacket on the table nearby. Stewart spoke to him, said something about putting on the life jacket and trying for a boat. Andrews did not respond. He appeared not to hear. Whether he was in shock, or in a kind of grief, or simply in the private space that people sometimes find at the end of something, the accounts do not say. Stewart left, Andrews stayed. What was the painting? A harbour scene in calm weather with small boats on gentle water. It seems too precisely symbolic to be accidental, but it was accidental. It was simply the painting that hung on that wall, in that room, in the ship that Andrews had designed. He had probably chosen the paintings himself, or approved them, in the months of planning before the ship launched. He was standing in front of one of his choices, in the room he had imagined and built, and the ship around him was ending. The time was 2 o'clock in the morning, the lights were flickering. The angle of the deck was extreme enough now that walking required holding on to something. The ship's bow was completely underwater. The forward funnel had collapsed into the sea with a noise that survivors described as like a thunderclap, a sound that carried across the water to the distant lifeboats and told the people in them something definitive about how much time was left. And still the band played, or still some of them played. Accounts differ about exactly when they stopped and what they were playing in the final minutes. The most famous account says they played Nearer My God to Thee. Others say the final tune was something else, something more secular. The uncertainty itself is somehow appropriate. The music became, in its final minutes, less a performance than a sound that people heard and made meaning of according to their own needs, their own beliefs, their own particular relationship to what was happening on the deck around them. Whether they played Nearer My God to Thee or something else, 8 men stood on a tilting deck and played music into the dark Atlantic night as long as they were able to stand, and then they stopped, and then the deck was no longer a place where standing was possible. By 1:45 in the morning, the forward well deck was under water. The water had been creeping up the bow for more than an hour, filling the space below first and then rising above the level of the deck itself, and now it was simply present, the Atlantic, on the deck of the ship that had been crossing it, present in a way that made the disaster visible to anyone who walked forward and looked. The officers had been watching this progression all night, marking it against their calculations of how long the ship had. Andrews had given the estimate of an hour and a half when they first assessed the flooding, and that estimate had been accurate. The ship was dying on the schedule he'd predicted, the flooding proceeding exactly as the physics required it to proceed. There was a particular quality to this accuracy that was harder to bear than if the estimates had been wrong, harder to bear than surprise would have been. The ship was dying as predicted, and the predictions had left no room for hope. The crowd on the boat deck had thinned as the boats departed. The remaining people were distributed unevenly across the deck, some at the stern, where the angle was less severe and standing was easier, some near the officers' quarters, where the last 2 collapsibles were being worked on, some simply standing or sitting wherever they had arrived, waiting for something, though the specific content of what they were waiting for differed from person to person. Some were waiting to be saved. Some had accepted that they would not be saved and were waiting for the end. Some were in a state between these two, not quite hoping, not quite accepting, suspended in the uncertainty that very extreme situations sometimes produce, where the mind has not yet completed the computation that the body and the evidence are already presenting to it. The officers moved through the deck with a professionalism that the circumstances did not require of them, and that they provided anyway. Murdoch worked on the starboard side. Lightoller worked on the port side. They were doing the last work available to do, loading the remaining collapsibles, managing the people still present, keeping the order that was rapidly becoming a formality in the face of something that could not be ordered. The distress rockets were still going up from the bridge. By this point in the night, more than a dozen had been fired, each one rising into the cold, clear sky and exploding in a white burst of light that was visible for miles in every direction. The people on the Californian who saw them had been seeing them for an hour. The officers on the Californian's bridge had debated their meaning and had not acted on it. The rockets continued to go up. Each rocket took approximately 8 seconds from launch to explosion. In those 8 seconds, anyone watching from the lifeboats or from other ships could see the trail of light rising, could anticipate the burst, could read it as what it was. A signal fired in urgency from a ship in distress, the maritime equivalent of a cry for help rendered in light and fire. The people in the Titanic's lifeboats, watching from a few hundred yards away, saw the rockets and understood them and could do nothing about them. The crew of the Californian, watching from 10 miles away, saw the rockets and understood them and could have done something about them and did not. This is one of the fixed facts of the night that does not yield to interpretation or sympathy. The rockets went up. They were seen. No one came. At approximately 1:55, water began reaching the forward end of the bridge. This was a specific threshold. The bridge was the symbolic and operational centre of the ship, and its flooding meant that the ship's remaining life was now measurable in minutes rather than in anything longer. Captain Smith had been on the bridge through most of the night, had released crew members from their duties at some point in the final hour, had walked through the ship in the way that captains walk through ships when the ships are ending. There are accounts that place him in various parts of the ship in the final half hour, accounts that seem credible individually, but that, taken together, suggest a man moving through his ship rather than remaining in any one place. The specific account of his final moments varies. Some say he was swept off the bridge when the water reached it. Some say he swam to a lifeboat and was encouraged to board and refused. Some say he went to the wireless room and thanked the operators. Some say he went down with the bridge itself holding the wheel. None of these accounts is definitive. What is definitive is that Smith was not among the survivors, and that no account of his final words or actions has the quality of something that was directly witnessed rather than reconstructed or imagined. He had commanded ships for more than 40 years. He had crossed the Atlantic hundreds of times. He had sailed through weather and ice and fog and the ordinary dangers of the sea, and he had never lost a ship. He was going to lose this one, and he knew it. And what he did with that knowledge in the final minutes was private to him, in the way that the last private things are always private, witnessed by no one who survived to tell what they saw. Second Officer Lightoller was one of the last officers off the ship. He was working on Collapsible B when the water reached the boat deck, working on it with the determination of someone who has a specific task and is going to complete it, or be stopped by something that makes completion impossible. The water reached the boat deck. He was swept off with the wave of water that came over the forward part of the deck. He found himself in the water. He found the upturned hull of Collapsible B beneath him. He climbed on. He began organising. His survival is one of the more remarkable facts of the night. A man who was on the ship until it was physically impossible to be on it any longer, who was pulled into the water by the flooding deck, who found a piece of wreckage and organised its occupants through the remaining hours of the night, who came aboard the Carpathia, and who then, within days, was giving testimony to investigators with the same precise professional competence that had characterised his performance throughout. The ship's funnel, the first one, the large forward funnel, collapsed into the water at approximately 2:15, with a sound that survivors described as like a giant explosion or a thunderclap, a noise so large that it was heard clearly by people in the lifeboats hundreds of yards away. The funnel falling killed several people who were in the water near it, and its collapse sent a wave outward that rocked the boats and reminded everyone, if reminding was needed, of the scale of what was happening. After the funnel fell, the end came quickly. The ship's bow was completely submerged. The angle of the stern was increasing with the speed that the changing centre of gravity imposed on it, and the angle was now severe enough that the ship's propellers were visible above the water, the enormous bronze screws that had driven the ship across the Atlantic, now turning slowly in the cold air, useless and exposed. People who had been clinging to the railings and deck fixtures as the angle increased were losing their grip. Some slid down the tilting deck into the water, some jumped. The sound of people hitting the water was another thing that the lifeboat survivors described. They could hear it even at the distance they had travelled. The sound of individual impacts in the silence between the ship's structural sounds, the evidence of people entering the water that would kill them. The lights went out. At 2:05, by most accounts, the power finally failed. The engineers in the engine room had kept it running until the flooding reached them, until the machinery was underwater, until there was nothing left to keep running, and then there was no power, and the lights went out all at once, everywhere on the ship simultaneously, and the ship that had been lit from stem to stern was suddenly dark, darker than anything around it, a dark presence rising from the water against the stars. This moment, the lights going out, appears in more survivor accounts than almost any other single event of the night, described with a kind of precision that suggests the image was burned into the memory at a depth that ordinary images are not burned. The ship was lit, and then it was dark, and the darkness changed everything, changed the nature of the event, changed what the people in the lifeboats were watching, changed the sky above the ship from something with a human light source in it to something that was only stars. The stars remained. They did not change. They did not respond to any of this. They were what they had been for the entire night, cold and brilliant and very far away, providing light that was beautiful and completely inadequate for the situation below them, present in their indifferent way that the universe is present, following its own rules regardless of what happens in the small specific places where human beings have arranged themselves. At 2:17 in the morning the ship broke apart. The stress on the steel hull had been building for an hour, the bow pulling downward with the weight of water, the stern rising as the bow descended, the middle section of the ship subjected to forces it had not been designed to absorb. The steel was good steel. The rivets were as sound as rivets could be in 1912, and they held longer than might have been expected. But there is a limit to what any material can hold when the forces working against it are large enough, and that limit was reached in the early minutes of April the 15th. The ship broke between the third and fourth funnels. The break was not instantaneous. It happened over a period of seconds, the hull giving way progressively, the sounds building to a climax that survivors in the lifeboats described with words like roar and thunder and crash. The bow section, completely flooded and enormously heavy, separated from the stern and disappeared almost immediately. It was gone underwater within a minute of the break, plunging at an angle of perhaps 45 degrees, pulling everything in it downward with tremendous speed. The stern section did something different. Freed from the weight of the bow, it fell back toward the water. The stern had been raised 30 or 40 feet in the air at the moment of the break, and landed with a tremendous impact, raising a wave that survivors in the nearby lifeboats could feel through the wood beneath them. And then the stern floated for a few minutes. The air pockets in the rear compartments provided enough buoyancy to keep it at the surface briefly, turning slowly, settling. The water finding its way in through every opening that the catastrophic break had created. Then it too went down, more slowly than the bow, with more resistance. The stern fought the water in a way that the bow, which had been mostly water itself by the end, had not. Survivors described it settling, then going more quickly, then being gone, the sea closing over it with the sound of water rushing into space, the final exhalation of a very large thing that had been above the surface and was now below it. The time was 2:20 in the morning. RMS Titanic was 2 miles and 300 meters below the surface of the Atlantic, in 2 main pieces, with a debris field of furniture and luggage and fittings and personal belongings scattered across the ocean floor in a zone several miles wide. It had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes from collision to disappearance. The ship that had been practically unsinkable had gone in less time than it takes to have a long dinner. What remained on the surface was the dark and the cold and 1,500 people in the water. The cold is worth dwelling on, because it's so far from what most people can access from their current position. Wherever you are right now, reading this or listening to it, you are presumably warm, presumably in a space that insulates you from the night. The North Atlantic in April is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 4 degrees Fahrenheit below the freezing point of fresh water, though salt water does not freeze at exactly the same temperature. What this means for a human body in the water is rapid loss of heat, the kind of loss that produces first pain, and then numbness, and then a confusion that is biological rather than psychological, the brain cooling along with the body, the thinking becoming slower and less organized, the will becoming harder to maintain. Most people in the water that night had perhaps 30 minutes. Some had less. A very few had more. They were younger, or had more body mass, or had found something to hold on to that kept them partially out of the water, or had simply been lucky in some biological way that is difficult to predict or account for. But 30 minutes was the general span, and the Carpathia was still more than 2 hours away. The sounds that came from the water reached the lifeboats. The people in the boats were close enough, a few hundred yards in some cases, to hear the voices of the people in the water. Some boats had rowed away quickly, fearing suction from the sinking ship or the rush of survivors that might swamp a boat. Some had stayed closer. All of them, at 2:20 in the morning, could hear what was happening in the water in the area where the ship had been. The word that survivors used most often for this sound was cry. The people in the water were crying out, calling for help, calling names, calling for God, making the sounds that cold and fear and despair produce in human throats. The sound carried across the flat, still water with great clarity. It was not a distant or abstract sound. It was immediate and specific, the sound of individual people, recognizable as human in the most basic possible way. And then, over the next half hour it diminished, not in any single moment but gradually, the way a fire diminishes, still present, still audible, still specific in its particular notes, but fewer, and then fewer. And then the silence that came after it was a different kind of silence than the silence before the ship had gone down. It was a silence with a weight to it, a silence that contained what it had replaced. Harold Bride on the upturned collapsible B heard it. He was in the water himself at this point, or more precisely, he was standing on the upturned hull with the water to his ankles, which was close enough. His feet were frostbitten. He had lost his shoes somewhere in the chaos. He stood on the slippery hull and shifted his weight when Lightoller called and listened to the voices diminishing and kept his balance. He would later describe what he heard without editorial comment, in the flat prose of a man giving testimony about something he had witnessed and was not yet able to process emotionally. The voices, the quiet that came after, the dark, the cold, the occasional shift and lurch of the hull beneath them as the water moved, Lightoller's voice calling adjustments, the stars. 5 distress rockets remained aboard the ship when she went down, or perhaps 6. The records are imprecise. They had been fired at intervals throughout the night, sent up by officers on the bridge in the standard maritime distress signal pattern. The crew of the Californian had watched them from 10 miles away and had not understood what they meant, or had understood and had not acted, and the rockets had risen and burst and fallen and been seen by no one who came to help. In the lifeboats, flares and lanterns were used through the night, small lights held up against the dark, signals that the Carpathia was looking for. One account describes a passenger holding up a lit piece of paper, burning her fingers to maintain the flame because there was nothing else to burn and the light seemed important. Another describes a crew member with a flashlight sweeping it across the water and the dark, again and again, until the batteries finally gave out. Light in the dark. This is such a basic human thing. The making of light against the dark, the signal that says I am here, that says we are here, that says please come. It is older than writing, older than ships, this impulse to make light and send it out. On the North Atlantic in the early hours of April the 15th, 1912, a few hundred people in open boats sent their small lights into the vastness and waited for something to answer. Somewhere to the southeast, moving at a speed that was pushing her engines beyond what her designers had intended, the Carpathia was racing through ice fields that her captain navigated at full speed in the dark, trusting his lookouts and his luck and his judgment. She had ice lookouts positioned in every elevated position on the ship. She had nearly hit 3 bergs in the dark. Rostron had kept going. He had his rocket supply ready, white rockets to fire at intervals, so that any survivors could see his approach from a distance and know that someone was coming. At 3:30 in the morning, the people in the lifeboat saw the first rocket from the Carpathia, a white burst of light on the southern horizon, miles away, unmistakable against the dark. The sound of it reached them some seconds after the light, sound travelling more slowly than light, the old physics that reminds you of the distances involved. And in the boats, there were cries. Not the cries of the water, not those. Different cries. The sounds of people who had been in despair, finding a reason to stop being in despair. The sounds of relief mixed with grief, hope mixed with loss. The complicated human response to rescue that arrives after enough time has passed to know what rescue could not undo. The lifeboats were out on the water for between 2 and 4 hours, depending on which one you were in and where it drifted and how hard the people in it rowed. Some of the boats had adequate crew, experienced seamen who knew how to handle a small boat, who could read the water and the wind and could make decisions about direction and speed. Some had almost no crew at all, and the passengers in them, who had never handled a ship's boat, had to work it out themselves. The cold was constant. 28 degrees Fahrenheit at the water's surface, a few degrees warmer in the air above it, but cold either way. Cold that moved through wool and cotton and leather with an ease that suggested it had no interest in what was between it and the skin it was seeking. People huddled together for warmth. Strangers held each other. Children were placed in the centre of groups where the bodies around them provided more insulation. In some boats, the more capable passengers organised systematic rotation, the people on the outside moving to the inside periodically, so that no one was on the edge for too long. In other boats, the organisation was less effective. In Lifeboat 6, under the nominal command of Quartermaster Hitchens, the argument between Hitchens and Molly Brown had settled into an uncomfortable standoff. He at one end of the boat refusing to row back, she at the other end maintaining her position, with the particular force of someone who is right and knows it, and is not going to stop being right simply because the situation is uncomfortable. The other passengers in the boat were mostly women, none of them trained sailors, managing their oars with the effort and imprecision of people doing something for the first time in difficult conditions. Brown eventually organised the rowing. She was strong and practical, and she had the ability, rare in crisis situations, to translate clear thinking into clear action, without the hesitation that normally interrupts the space between knowing what should be done and doing it. She assigned oars to women who could manage them and showed them the stroke and kept the pace, and made sure that the exertion of rowing was doing what it needed to do, keeping people warm, keeping the boat moving, giving the people in it something to do other than think about what was happening around them. The thinking was the enemy. In the lifeboats, in the dark, with the ship gone and the sounds from the water diminishing, and the cold pressing in from every direction, the mind had very little to do but think. and thinking about this situation, the specifics of it, the mathematics of it, the precise circumstances that had led from a pleasant evening aboard the finest ship in the world to a wooden boat in the dark in the middle of the Atlantic. Thinking produced nothing useful. The thinking that helped was tactical thinking, how to row more efficiently, how to keep the children warm, how to locate the other boats, how to read the horizon for the lights of a rescue ship. The Carpathia was somewhere to the south and east. No one in the lifeboats knew exactly where, but Rostron had been firing rockets at 50-minute intervals since he came within range, and the rockets were visible. A distant white burst against the dark horizon that said as clearly as words that something was coming. The first sighting of a Carpathia rocket was a significant moment in each boat, described in survivor accounts as a collective release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. In Boat 14, 5th Officer Lowe had carried out the only organised rescue attempt. He had waited because he understood, from training and from the evidence of his ears, that the area around the sinking ship would be dangerous in the immediate aftermath, people in the water grabbing for anything, capable of swamping a lifeboat by sheer weight of desperation. He waited until he judged the immediate danger had passed. He transferred passengers from his boat to others to make room. He then rowed back into the debris field. The debris field was vast. Deck chairs and luggage and wood and pieces of the ship's fittings floated across several miles of ocean, and among them, or clinging to them, or sitting in the partially swamped collapsible A, were the few people who had survived the water long enough for Lowe to reach them. He pulled one man alive from the water, a Chinese passenger who had been keeping himself afloat on a piece of wreckage with a tenacity that the cold had not yet defeated. The man was barely conscious when he came into the boat, but he was alive. The others were not. Lowe and his crew pulled bodies from the water and searched for signs of life and found none. The 30 minutes that the cold allows for survival in the North Atlantic had passed, or close enough that the difference did not matter. They rowed back toward the cluster of lifeboats with one survivor and the knowledge of what they had seen. This is the hardest part of the lifeboat story to hold, the gap between the room in the boats and the people in the water. The boats collectively had space for several hundred more people than they carried. The people in the water needed that space. The two facts existed simultaneously in the dark for the 30 minutes that determined who would live and who would not, and almost nothing moved between them. The reasons were multiple and have been analysed extensively. Fear of being swamped was real and legitimate. A fully loaded boat risks capsize, and a lifeboat full of non-sailors in the dark would have been in genuine danger if desperate people in the water had grabbed for it. But the boats were not full. Some were dramatically underloaded, and the additional people they could have safely carried were dying in the water a few hundred yards away. The calculation required to understand this, the comparison between the empty seats and the voices, was available to anyone with a lantern and an inclination to do it. Most did not do it. The cold and the darkness and the shock and the fear and the particular leadership failures of some of the men in charge of the boats, all of this contributed to a decision that was made collectively and mostly unconsciously, the decision to stay away. It is easy to judge from a distance and from warmth. It is less easy to know what you would have done in a boat in the dark in 28-degree air, with the sound of dying people a few hundred yards away. The silence, when it came, was described by nearly every survivor who wrote about it. The voices stopped, gradually, and then completely, and the dark and the cold and the occasional creak of an oar were what was left. Eva Hart, 7 years old in her lifeboat, remembered it. Charlotte Collier remembered it. Lawrence Beasley, noting everything in the careful way of a science teacher, noted it. The silence after the voices was the moment when the disaster was complete, when it had finished the active part of its business and settled into its aftermath. The stars were extraordinary. This too appears in the accounts. The extraordinary quality of the stars on that particular night, the way the absence of moon and cloud allowed the Milky Way to be visible from horizon to horizon, the way individual stars were bright enough to cast shadows on the water. Some of the people in the lifeboats, between the terror and the grief and the cold, noticed the stars. Some found them comforting. Some found them intolerable, because a sky that beautiful over a sea that was full of the recently dead was a kind of cosmic indifference that was difficult to integrate. The waiting was long. Between the last voices from the water and the first light of the Carpathia's approach, the people in the boats waited in the dark and the cold for what felt, and may have been something close to 2 hours. They rubbed each other's hands, they told each other stories. Some of them prayed, some of them wept. Some of them fell into a state that was not quite sleep, but that the cold and the exhaustion and the shock produced. A kind of absence, a dimming of awareness, the body conserving what it could. When the Carpathia's first rocket went up at 3:30 in the morning, the boats had been on the water for between 90 minutes and 3 hours. The reaction in each boat to the sight of that rocket was one of the most described moments in all the survivor accounts, partly because it was, in the literal sense, a sighting, a thing that could be seen and that altered the situation, and partly because it did something to the people in the boats that was recognisable and important. Relief is the word most often used, but relief is too small a word for what it was. It was something that moved through people physically, that changed the quality of their breathing and their posture, that unlocked something that the cold and the fear had been holding closed for a long time. They started rowing toward the light. In most of the boats, rowing was the first action, pointing the bow toward the distant glow, taking up the oars, beginning the slow work of covering the distance between where they were and where the rescue ship would be. The work of rowing in the cold after hours of exposure was enormously difficult. But it was possible, and the light was there, ahead of them, growing slowly closer in the way that distant lights grow as you move toward them. The Carpathia arrived at 4:10 in the morning. She was a mid-size Cunard liner, built for service rather than speed, designed for the cargo passenger trade between New York and the Mediterranean, and she'd been pushed to 14.5 knots that night when her designed maximum was about 14. The extra half knot had been extracted from her by Rostron's determination and his engineers' willingness to feed her fires harder than they normally fed them, and it had cost her perhaps 20 minutes, had moved the arrival from 4:30 to 4:10, and those 20 minutes had not made a difference to the people already in the water, but had perhaps made a difference to the people still alive in the boats. The sea around the Carpathia when she arrived was very dark. The sun would not rise for another 2 hours, and the stars, so bright earlier in the night, were now dimming slightly toward the beginning of the long transition to dawn. The Carpathia's searchlights moved across the water and found the lifeboats. First one, then another, then more as the boats converged on her position, guided by her lights and her rockets, rowing toward her through the cold. The boarding process was slow. The lifeboats came alongside the ship one by one, and the survivors were helped up rope ladders or brought up in chairs rigged from the davits. Those who could climb, climbed, and those who could not were lifted. The first survivors came aboard at 4:30. The last came aboard at 8:30 in the morning after nearly 4 hours of work. 710 people in all. The Carpathia's own passengers, who had been woken at 3 in the morning and told that Titanic had sunk and that they were going to her survivors, had given their blankets and their clothing and the contents of their medical kits. The ship's doctor and his staff worked throughout the night and the following morning treating injuries, frostbite, shock, hypothermia. The dining rooms were converted to sleeping areas. Cabins were doubled up. Every available space on the ship was given over to the survivors. What was it like to come aboard? The accounts describe warmth above everything else. The warmth of the ship, the warmth of the blankets, the warmth of the hot coffee and soup that the Carpathia's crew pressed into their hands as soon as they were on deck. People who had been in the cold for 2 or 3 hours, some of them wet, some of them barely able to hold themselves upright, described the warmth as almost overwhelming, as something that moved through the body with the quality of relief that is physical before it is emotional. And then the counting began, the survivors finding each other or failing to find each other. The ship's manifest being compared to the faces present, the absence becoming audible as people asked for names and received no answer. Where is my husband? Where is my father? Where are the children? Where is she? I cannot find him anywhere. The Carpathia became, in those morning hours, a ship navigating between two kinds of reality, the survivors and the lost, and the distance between those two realities was not navigable by anyone. Madeleine Astor came aboard. She was 18 years old and 4 months pregnant and a widow, and she'd been in a lifeboat for several hours, and whatever she was feeling in that moment is not recorded in any account she gave. She was met by members of her husband's family and helped to a cabin. Her son, John Jacob Astor VI, would be born in August. He would carry his father's name and his father's absence through a long life. Molly Brown came aboard with the characteristic force of her personality intact. She'd spent the hours in the lifeboat organising, arguing, rowing, keeping spirits up, and she arrived on the Carpathia already thinking about what came next: how to organise relief for the survivors, how to collect funds, how to help the people around her who had lost more than she had. She established the Survivors Committee on the Carpathia and began collecting money for the survivors who were travelling without any means, without luggage, without the resources that would allow them to manage when they arrived in New York. Lawrence Beasley, the science teacher, was on the Carpathia with his notebook. He had been taking notes throughout the night, not as journalism exactly, not as any premeditated project, but because observation was his habit, and the habit did not stop even in catastrophe. His account of the disaster, published within months of the sinking, became one of the most reliable and detailed testimonies of the night. He described what he saw with the precision of a man trained to notice things, and the precision was a gift to everyone who came after him trying to understand what had happened. Second Officer Lightoller was among the last to come aboard. He had been on the upturned collapsible B for more than 4 hours, commanding it in the way he commanded everything, steadily, methodically, without drama. When the Carpathia arrived, he organised the transfer of his charges, the men on the upturned hull, to other boats, and then came aboard himself. He was later the officer most associated with the strict enforcement of women and children first, and his decisions on that score would be both praised and criticised in the inquiries that followed. He served in the First World War. He served in the Second World War, bringing a boat full of evacuees out of Dunkirk in 1940 at the age of 66. He was not a man who ran from difficulty. Harold Bride came aboard supported by 2 men because his feet were too badly frostbitten to bear his weight. He was taken to the wireless room, where he sat in a chair and assisted the Carpathia's wireless operator, Harold Cottam, in sending messages about the disaster. He was in considerable pain. He kept working anyway. The messages went out, to the White Star Line, to the Coast Guard, to the newspapers who were already asking, to the families who were already waiting. The world was beginning to understand what had happened, and it was understanding it through the wireless signals going out from this small room on a medium-sized ship steaming toward New York. The bodies in the water were a problem that had no good solution. The Carpathia's captain made the decision to prioritise the living, to find and rescue survivors before attempting to recover the dead. This was the right decision in the sense that it was the decision that saved the most lives, but it meant that the bodies remained in the water, in the ice field, and were seen by the survivors in the lifeboats and then left behind as the Carpathia moved away. Several later ships were dispatched specifically to recover bodies, and they found them spread across a large area of ocean. More than 300 were recovered. Nearly 1,000 were never found. The ice field was still there in the morning, visible in the early light, a landscape of bergs and growlers stretching to the south and west, some of them large enough to be called mountains, the frozen pieces of Greenland that had drifted into the shipping lane and whose presence had changed everything. In the growing light, the Carpathia's passengers came on deck to look at the ice, and some of them who had never seen pack ice before were struck by its beauty, the blue and white of it, the strange clarity it gave the water, the way it caught the early sun. Beauty as the context for disaster, the world's indifference rendered in ice and light. At 8:30 in the morning, the last survivor came aboard. The Carpathia's captain assessed the situation, confirmed that there were no more boats to be found, and set a course for New York. The wireless traffic between the Carpathia and the shore was enormous. Questions coming in faster than answers could be sent. Newspapers and shipping companies and governments all wanting information. Families wanting to know whether their people were alive. The whole anxious world trying to understand what had happened in the dark Atlantic. The voyage to New York took 3.5 days. The Carpathia carried her passengers south and west, through weather that was gentler than the night that had produced them, and arrived in New York Harbour on the evening of April the 18th in a rain that seemed appropriate, in a silence that was broken by the tugboats and the crowds on the pier, and the reporters and the relatives and the simply curious who had come to the waterfront to witness this arrival. The city received them the way cities receive the survivors of disasters, with a mixture of relief and grief and curiosity and practical concern, the emotions that large events produce in the people who are adjacent to them without being inside them. The Astor family was on the pier. The Strauss family was on the pier. Families of crew members, many of them from Southampton, had been waiting for news for days and were still not sure who would come off the ship. The survivors walked down the gangway into the rain of New York carrying what they had, which was in most cases very little. A blanket, the clothes they had been wearing, whatever had been given to them on the Carpathia. They walked back into a world that had existed only 4 days ago, but that felt from the inside of the disaster as if it belonged to a different era entirely. The inquiries began before the Carpathia had docked. Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan had been following the wireless report since the night of the disaster, and he arranged to have investigators board the Carpathia as she arrived at the pier. He wanted testimony taken immediately, before memories faded or were shaped by the accounts of others. He wanted to know what had happened before anyone had had time to decide what they were willing to say about it. Smith was an unusual choice to lead a maritime inquiry. He knew nothing about ships. His critics in the British press, when news of the American inquiry reached England, pointed this out with some relish. What could a senator from the American Midwest possibly understand about the technical and professional questions involved in the loss of a British ship on the high seas? Smith's response was essentially that not understanding ships might be an advantage, that the people who understood ships were the ones who had decided that the practices that led to the disaster were acceptable, and that perhaps a fresh set of eyes was exactly what was needed. He was not entirely wrong. The American inquiry was conducted with a thoroughness that surprised even its critics, and its findings, inadequate lifeboats, failure to heed ice warnings, poor emergency procedures, were substantively correct. Some of the specific technical conclusions were questioned by maritime experts, but the broad picture that emerged was accurate. The British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, was more formal and more technically sophisticated, and it reached broadly similar conclusions. The regulations regarding lifeboats needed to change. The procedures for handling ice warnings needed to change. The standards for lifeboat drills and emergency preparation needed to change. These were the findings, and they were translated into regulation with a speed that reflected the political pressure of the moment. When more than 1,500 people die in a disaster that the press has described as preventable, governments tend to act. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, was convened in 1914, 2 years after the disaster. Its provisions required ships to carry lifeboats for everyone aboard, not a fraction of passengers, not a percentage calculated on tonnage, but everyone. It required continuous wireless watch, so that no ship would ever again go off the air at a critical moment because the operator was tired. It established the International Ice Patrol, which began monitoring the iceberg tracks of the North Atlantic and is still doing so today. More than a century later, the Ice Patrol still operates, and no ship that has heeded its warnings has been lost to ice since the service began. The wireless communication reforms were perhaps the most immediately significant. The requirement for continuous watch, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, meant that the kind of breakdown that had left the Californian deaf to Titanic's calls could not happen legally again. Ships at sea would be connected to each other and to the shore at all times, in the way that the technology allowed. The disaster had revealed both the potential and the limitation of wireless communication, and the regulatory response addressed the limitation. Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian spent the rest of his life defending his actions on the night of April the 14th. His defenders argued that he had been in command of a small ship in an ice field in the dark, that he had made conservative decisions consistent with his responsibility for his crew and his ship, that the identification of the mystery ship seen from the Californian as Titanic was uncertain, that the interpretation of the rockets as distress signals rather than company signals was not unambiguous. His critics argued that these defences were rationalizations for a failure to act in the face of obvious emergency, that any seaman seeing white rockets fired over a ship in the middle of the night should have responded regardless of uncertainty. The debate has never been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The Californian Inquiry of 1965, conducted by the British Board of Trade, revisited the evidence and concluded that Lord had been negligent. Maritime historians continue to argue about the details. What is not arguable is that the Californian did not come to Titanic's assistance that night, and that her presence, 10 or 20 miles away, stopped in the ice with her wireless off, represents one of the great what-ifs of the disaster. J. Bruce Ismay, who had survived by taking a place in collapsible sea, gave testimony at both inquiries and spent the rest of his life in a form of public purgatory. The press had been merciless. J. Bruce Ismay, the newspapers called him, the managing director who had saved himself while women and children died. He maintained, consistently, that he had not taken a place in the boat until he was certain no women or children were waiting, that his action had been, if not heroic, at least not criminal. He withdrew from public life almost completely in the years following the disaster, spent time in Ireland, rarely appeared in society. He died in 1937, having never recovered the reputation he had before April 1912. Thomas Andrews was commemorated in his hometown of Comber in County Down in Ireland. A memorial hall was built. His face appeared on a plaque. The accounts of survivors, their testimony about his behaviour during the evacuation, his calm and his practical helpfulness, the way he moved through the ship helping people without apparent concern for his own position in it, established him as one of the more admirable figures of the disaster, which is a modest kind of immortality but is not nothing. The families of the victims received varying degrees of support and acknowledgement. The wealthy first-class passengers had estates and lawyers, and the resources to manage loss financially. However, they managed it emotionally. The working-class families, particularly the crew families in Southampton, where entire streets had lost their breadwinners, were dependent on relief funds and the charity of organisations that were doing their best, with resources that were nowhere near adequate to the need. Southampton was the community most directly devastated by the disaster. The crew of Titanic was largely Southampton men, stokers and stewards and engineers and officers who lived in the terrace streets near the docks, who came home to the same houses every few weeks between voyages, whose wives and children had watched them leave on the morning of April the 10th. The streets of the Chapel district, the area around Northam Road and Upper Bugle Street, lost so many residents that they became known locally as Streets of the Dead, a designation that captures something about the grief that had moved into those houses and sat there in the spring of 1912 and the month that followed. The White Star Line paid some compensation and resisted more. The legal liability of a shipping company in 1912 was significantly more limited than it would be in any later era, and the company's lawyers worked with the legal tools available to them to minimise the financial exposure. This was not unique to the White Star Line. It was standard corporate behaviour of the era, but it added a quality of insult to the injury that the families of crew members felt and spoke about in testimony and in letters and in the quiet of their diminished lives. The Titanic story did not end with the disaster or the inquiries or the settlements. It kept growing, kept accumulating meaning, in the way that certain events do, events that arrive at the intersection of technology and class and hubris and tragedy, events that speak to things people need to think about and find it useful to have an example for. The ship that was practically unsinkable, the ship of dreams, the ship that carried the richest people in the world and the poorest people in the world, and lost them in proportions that reflected exactly the social hierarchy of the time. This was a story with deep roots in the concerns of the 20th century, and it remained relevant as those concerns shifted and evolved. New films were made, new books were written. Each generation found in the disaster the particular mirror it needed. Sometimes the mirror of class, sometimes the mirror of technological hubris, sometimes the mirror of human behaviour under extreme conditions, sometimes simply the mirror of loss, of the way ordinary life can end with a sound you barely hear in the night, a sensation you mistake for something minor, a 37-second contact that changes everything. The ship itself lay on the bottom of the Atlantic undisturbed, 2 miles down, 2.5 miles. The bow section and the stern section separated by nearly a half-mile of debris field, both of them settling into the mud of the ocean floor, slowly, over the months and years that followed the sinking until they were part of the bottom in the way that things become part of where they land if they stay there long enough. The 3.5 days from the rescue site to New York were strange days. The Carpathia was not designed to carry more passengers than she had. She was a medium-sized liner on the Mediterranean run, with a complement appropriate to that service, and the addition of 710 survivors changed the character of the ship completely. The survivors were everywhere, in the dining rooms that had been converted to sleeping areas, in the hallways, in spaces that Carpathia's own passengers had given up with a generosity that the accounts describe as consistent and genuine. Carpathia's passengers, the people who had been sleeping when the disaster happened, who had woken to find their ship racing through ice fields in the dark toward a position where something had gone terribly wrong, had responded in the way that people respond when they are given an immediate and obvious way to help. They gave their cabins, they gave their clothes, they distributed blankets and food with the efficiency of people who have a task they can do and are grateful for it. The ship's doctors worked without stopping. The ship's crew worked without stopping. The survivors arrived in states that ranged from physically intact to gravely compromised. Most had been exposed to the cold for several hours. Some had been in the water, in the partially flooded collapsible A, or clinging to the upturned hull of collapsible B, and their hypothermia was more severe. Harold Bride's frostbitten feet required immediate medical attention. Several other survivors had injuries from the chaos of the evacuation: cuts, bruises, sprains from the scrambles down rope ladders or the jostle of crowded boats. A few would die within days of reaching New York, their bodies unable to recover from the combined effects of cold and shock and the specific physiological insults of the night. The counting began as soon as the rescue was complete. The Carpathia's wireless operator, Harold Cottam, who had been working without rest since the disaster, was now tasked with transmitting the survivor list to the White Star Line and to the press. Bride, despite his frostbitten feet, came to the wireless room and helped. The list went out in fragments, not because of any deliberate withholding, but because the compilation took time. Names had to be confirmed, spellings had to be agreed upon. The chaos of 2,000 people boarding multiple boats in the dark had to be disentangled into legible records. The news reaching shore was fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. One early report suggested that all passengers had been saved and the ship was being towed to Halifax. This report was wrong, but it circulated widely enough to create a period of false hope for some families before the true picture emerged. The White Star Line's offices in New York and London were besieged by people seeking information. The operators there did their best with information that was incomplete and coming in slowly over a wireless link that could handle only so much traffic. On the Carpathia, the survivors were doing the work of beginning to understand what had happened to them. For most of them, the night had been a sequence of immediate events: the collision, the instructions, the boats, the water, that had demanded practical responses rather than contemplative ones. Now, for the first time, there was space to think about it, and thinking about it was very difficult. Lawrence Beasley wrote. He had his notebook and his training as an observer, and he understood that he was among the witnesses to something historically significant, and that the obligation of being a witness was to record accurately what you had seen. He sat in whatever space he could find on the Carpathia, and he wrote about the sound of the ship hitting the iceberg, and the angle of the deck as the ship sank, and the way the lifeboats had been loaded, and the quality of the light on the water when the Carpathia arrived. He was a science teacher. He believed in the value of precise description. His account, published within months of the disaster, became one of the primary sources for understanding what had happened. Others could not write. Some sat silently for the entire crossing, in the particular silence that serious trauma produces in some people. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of something that has not yet found its way back into language. They ate when food was brought to them and slept when they could sleep and looked at the ocean through the portholes with an expression that those watching them found difficult to meet. Margaret Brown organised. This was simply what she did. It was her response to everything, to find the tasks that needed doing and organise other people into doing them. She established the Titanic Survivors Committee on the Carpathia, collected money from Carpathia's own passengers for the survivors who were arriving without funds or resources, distributed the money according to need, made lists of what various survivors required, and coordinated the provision of those things. She was energetic and effective, and her energy was, in the circumstances, a kind of life force that other survivors found sustaining. The children aboard the Carpathia were a particular focus of attention. Some of them had lost parents. The Navratil boys, Michelle and Edmund, 4 and 2, spoke no English, and did not understand where they were or why their father was not there. They were fed and kept warm and looked after by a rotating group of women passengers and Carpathia crew members, and they adapted to this new reality with the resilience that small children sometimes have in incomprehensible situations. Not understanding enough to be fully frightened, finding in the people around them enough warmth and attention to maintain a kind of equilibrium. Their photograph was taken on the Carpathia. It appeared in newspapers when the ship arrived in New York. 2 small boys looking somewhat bewildered, but not obviously distressed, and their mother, who had been in France since their father had taken them, saw the photograph and recognised them and came to New York to claim them. This small reunion was the only unambiguously good outcome of the disaster, a thread of something not heartbreaking in a story that was otherwise entirely heartbreaking. Captain Rostron stood watch for most of the crossing to New York. He had pushed his ship hard during the rescue, beyond her normal limits, through ice fields in the dark, at speeds that his chief engineer had questioned and that Rostron had insisted upon anyway. And now he was managing a ship that was carrying twice as many people as she was designed to carry, navigating to New York through weather that was turning worse as they moved west and south, dealing with the wireless traffic and the survivor management and all the other demands that a rescue operation of this magnitude placed on a ship and its captain. He was asked later whether he had been frightened during the ice navigation on the way to the wreck site. His answer was characteristically direct. He had been too busy to be frightened. This is one of the things about Rostron's account of the night that feels authentic. The busyness of the executive function, the way making rapid decisions about concrete practical matters crowds out the space in which fear normally operates. He had been doing things one after another without pause, and there had been no room for fear in that sequence. The arrival in New York on the evening of April the 18th was dramatic in the way that arrivals after disasters tend to be dramatic. The combination of relief and grief, and public attention, and private searching through crowds for the faces of the people you needed to find. The pier was packed. The press was there. The White Star Line officials were there. The police were there. The relatives were there. Thousands of them, having waited for 3.5 days for information that the wireless could provide only in fragments, and that the actual arrival would confirm or deny. It rained. The accounts mention the rain as a detail that felt appropriate, that fit the mood of the occasion in a way that sunshine would not have. The survivors came down the gangway in whatever they were wearing, their own clothes if they had them, borrowed clothes from Carpathia's passengers if they did not, and met the crowd and the cameras and the officials and, if they were lucky, the specific faces they had been hoping to find. Some found those faces, some did not. Madeline Astor, 18 and pregnant and now a widow, was met by the Astor family and whisked efficiently away from the cameras. The crew members who survived were collected by White Star Line officials. The immigrant survivors who had been travelling to relatives found, in some cases, those relatives waiting at the pier, people who had made the journey from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and Ohio, on the slim hope that the name on the survivor list they had seen in the newspaper was the name they needed it to be. The city opened around them and received them, as cities receive the survivors of things that have happened elsewhere, with the particular combination of sympathy and distance that characterizes the relationship between those who experienced something and those who only heard about it. New York in April 1912 was full of people who had heard about Titanic, who had followed the wireless reports, who had their own feelings about what had happened. The survivors moved through a city that had been grieving for them, into lives that were now permanently divided by this night into before and after. For 73 years, the exact location of Titanic's wreck was unknown. The ship had gone down in the middle of the North Atlantic in deep water, and the position that had been transmitted from the wireless room, the position that Rostron had steered toward, was later determined to be slightly inaccurate, off by perhaps 13 miles. This was not Phillips's error, or the navigator's error exactly. It was the accumulated imprecision of the celestial navigation of the era, which was very good by the standards of 1912 and not quite good enough to fix a wreck site to the resolution that would allow it to be found. Several expeditions went looking for the wreck in the decades after the disaster. The ocean was simply too deep for the technology available. 2.5 miles of water is 2.5 miles of pressure and darkness and complexity, and the equipment required to search it meaningfully did not exist until the 1970s and 1980s, when advances in deep water sonar and remotely operated vehicles made systematic searching of the deep ocean floor possible for the first time. Robert Ballard was the oceanographer who found her. He was working with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and he had been trying to find the wreck for years, had partnered with the US Navy in a program that used the search for Titanic as cover for a classified mission to inspect the wrecks of lost American nuclear submarines on the ocean floor, the Thresher and the Scorpion, which were of ongoing concern to the Navy and which lay in the same general region. The submarine inspections were the official purpose. The Titanic search was what Ballard had been given permission to do with his remaining time. He found her on September the 1st, 1985, at approximately 1 in the morning, a fitting hour given the history. His team was monitoring sonar returns on a screen in the ship's laboratory, when the image changed, when the flat ocean floor was interrupted by debris, when specific shapes appeared that were recognizable as human-made, as the fittings and equipment of a ship, and then the boiler appeared on the screen, one of Titanic's enormous double-ended boilers sitting upright on the ocean floor, unmistakable in its form. Ballard described the moment in his accounts as one of mixed awe and grief. The thing he had been searching for was there, on the screen, and it was also a grave, and those two facts sat uneasily together in the way they would continue to sit uneasily together for everyone who went to the wreck afterward. The images that followed, the bow section, the grand staircase well, the staircase itself long gone, dissolved by wood-eating bacteria but the well still there, the hull's railing, the individual pieces of wreckage scattered across the ocean floor, were extraordinary. They were also heartbreaking. The wreck told a story that the survivors' accounts had not quite settled. The question of whether the ship had broken apart before sinking or had gone down intact had been debated for decades. Some survivors said they had seen the ship break, others said it had gone down in one piece, and the disagreement had seemed irresolvable. The wreck resolved it. The bow and stern were 2.5 miles apart. They had not gone down together. The ship had broken, exactly as some witnesses had reported. The images from the wreck became some of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. The bow half buried in the sediment, with its railing still intact. The stern, more badly damaged, partially imploded by the pressure of its rapid descent. The debris field scattered across the ocean floor, a child's shoe, a chandelier, a doll's head, a safe, thousands of dinner plates, thousands of items of luggage and personal property, the accumulated stuff of 2,000 lives frozen in the cold dark 2.5 miles below the surface. The artifacts raised questions that are not entirely rhetorical, questions about what should be done with a site that is, by any reasonable definition, a grave. Nearly 1,500 people had died in or near the ship. Some of their remains were in the wreck. Most were not. The cold water had preserved very little organic material, but the space was associated with their deaths in a way that made its treatment feel morally significant. Subsequent expeditions retrieved artifacts, thousands of them, eventually, pieces of the ship's fittings, personal items from the debris field, sections of hull plate, the ship's bell. These were displayed in exhibitions, some of them touring internationally, and the exhibitions were attended by millions of people who found in the objects a connection to the event that no book or film quite provided. There was something about holding, or standing near, an actual cup from the ship, an actual letter from a passenger's pocket, something that the two-dimensionality of text and image could not replicate. The wreck itself was deteriorating. Iron-eating bacteria had been consuming the metal since the ship went down, producing the distinctive icicle-like formations called rusticles that draped the hull in photographs. Beautiful, in a way, in the way that decay can be beautiful when it takes its time and does its work with the slow precision of biology. The rusticles were consuming the iron of the hull at a rate that would, eventually, leave very little behind. Estimates suggested that the bow section might collapse within decades, that within 100 years of its discovery there might not be much left to see. This impermanence, the fact that even the physical wreck, even the steel and iron, was temporary, added another layer to the meditation on what the Titanic disaster meant and what could be preserved of it. The survivors were gone now. The last confirmed survivor, Milvina Dean, had been a 9-week-old infant when the ship sank and had died in 2009, at 97. The physical objects were slowly being absorbed by the deep ocean. The official records were in archives. The living connection to the event was severing, one thread at a time, until only the accounts remained. The books and the films and the testimonies, the stories of what people saw and felt and chose on a cold April night in 1912. And the stories remained. They remained because the story of Titanic speaks to something persistent in human experience, the collision between what we build and what we meet in the world that we did not build, between our planning and our circumstances, between the confidence we bring to great enterprises and the limitations that enterprises encounter when they move out of the space of planning and into the space of actual events. Every century has this story in some form. Titanic is one of the 20th century's versions of it. There is also the simpler level at which the story works, the level at which it is about specific people, with specific names and ages and plans and relationships, who were crossing an ocean on a ship that sank. Astor and Guggenheim and the Strauss couple and the Sage family and Eugene Daly and Frederick Fleet in The Crow's Nest, and Jack Phillips at the key and the 8 musicians on the tilted deck and the engineers in the flooded engine rooms. These were people. They were not symbols or metaphors first. They were people who had been somewhere else before they were on the ship and who expected to be somewhere else again after it. The memorial services held in the years following the disaster were attempts to hold that specificity, to say these names, these particular names, into a space that could contain them. Southampton holds memorials. The community of Colne in Lancashire holds a memorial for Wallace Hartley. Belfast, where the ship was built, holds memorials. The dates April the 14th and 15th remain in the maritime calendar as the dates of the disaster, and they are marked quietly in the places where the connections to it are still personal, still held in family memory, still the property of people whose great-grandparents were aboard. What is the name you hold? Everyone who comes to this story comes with a reason. Someone read about it as a child and it struck them. Someone has a family connection. Someone is drawn to the maritime history or the period history or the engineering story. Someone simply finds that the particular combination of elements, the magnitude, the speed, the human drama, the cold water, the cold mathematics of the lifeboats, produces a quality of attention in them that other stories do not. All of these are valid reasons to be here, to be listening to this, in whatever hour of your night this is. The ship is still down there. She's been there for more than 100 years now. The Atlantic moves above her without knowledge of her presence. The fish that live at that depth, and there are fish at 2.5 miles, extraordinary creatures adapted to the cold and the pressure, move through the corridors and rooms without any awareness that this was once a place where people slept and ate and talked and danced and worried about ordinary things. The ship is simply part of the ocean floor now, in the way that everything becomes part of what surrounds it, eventually, if it stays long enough. Memory is a strange curator. It keeps some things and loses others, and the things it keeps are not always the things that were most important at the time. They are the things that fit the shapes of what came later, the things that spoke to questions that subsequent years made significant. The Titanic disaster has been remembered continuously for more than a century, but what is remembered has shifted, has changed its emphasis, has reflected the particular concerns of each era that inherited the story. In the years immediately after the disaster, the emphasis was on heroism. The accounts that circulated most widely were accounts of men who gave up lifeboat seats to women, of musicians who played while the ship sank, of engineers who stayed at their posts. These stories were not false. They described things that actually happened. But they were curated, selected for emphasis, in ways that shaped what the public understood about the night. The class disparity in survival rates was noted but not dwelt upon. The failures of evacuation were acknowledged but not emphasized. The story was shaped, in those years, by a culture that needed heroism and found it. By the 1950s and 1960s, the emphasis had shifted somewhat. The technical failures received more attention, the inadequate lifeboat regulations, the ice warning procedures, the design choices that had allowed 5 compartments to flood when 4 were the design maximum. This was the era of the safety reform, of the post-war confidence in engineering solutions and regulatory frameworks, and the Titanic story was read as a story about what better engineering and better regulation could prevent. By the 1980s and 1990s, after the wreck was found and James Cameron had made his film and the broader culture had moved through several decades of questioning inherited hierarchies, the class elements of the disaster received more serious examination. The disparity between first-class and third-class survival rates, the locked gates, the language barriers, the stewards who abandoned their posts. These were not new facts. They had been in the testimony from the beginning, but they were now being read as central to the story rather than peripheral to it, as evidence of systemic failure rather than individual moral failure. Each era brings its own questions to the material, and the material accommodates them. The disaster is large enough and complex enough to speak to almost any question you bring to it. This is part of what makes it persistent. The story is not closed. It keeps opening. The survivors who lived long lives after the disaster were sometimes the keepers of this openness, the people whose continued existence in the world kept the event from becoming purely historical, from becoming something that could only be known through documents rather than felt through presence. Lawrence Beesley wrote his account quickly and wrote it well, and the fact that it was written quickly meant that the details were fresh, and the prose had the quality of someone still inside the experience rather than looking back at it from a safe distance. Archibald Gracie, the first-class passenger who had spent hours on the upturned collapsible B before being rescued, wrote his account of the disaster with similar urgency, interviewing other survivors as they crossed on the Carpathia and in the days after arriving in New York. He died in December 1912, 8 months after the disaster. The cold and the physical ordeal of those hours in the water had done something to him that his body could not fully repair. His book was published posthumously. Jack Thayer, who had been 17 and had jumped from the ship and survived on Collapsible B alongside Latola and Bride, gave detailed accounts over the years that provided some of the most precise descriptions of the ship's final moments. The angle, the sound, the breakup. He drew sketches of what he had seen from the water. He was 17, and he was watching the largest ship in the world come apart above him, and the sketches he made from memory afterward were accurate enough that they were used by engineers trying to understand the dynamics of the sinking. He lived until 1945. He died by his own hand 2 months after his son was killed in the Pacific theatre of the Second World War. His death, like his survival, was a detail that the larger story absorbed and moved past, but it is worth pausing on. The particular weight that the people who lived through that night carried, the way the night stayed in them, the way trauma from catastrophic events does not simply end when the event ends but continues, takes up residence, changes the shape of the life that continues after it. Milvina Dean was 9 weeks old on the night of April the 14th. She was travelling in third class with her parents and her brother, and her father, aware that something was seriously wrong, roused the family early and got them to the boat deck while boats were still available. Milvina and her brother and her mother survived. Her father did not. She grew up without knowing him only through photographs and the accounts of others, through the shape of his absence in her life. She spoke about the disaster in her later years with a quality of mild bemusement at the attention it generated. She had been 9 weeks old, she could not remember anything, and yet she was considered one of its last living connections, sought out for interviews and conventions and commemorative events, treated as a kind of witness to something she had no memory of witnessing. She was always gracious about this. She died in 2009, 97 years old, the last survivor of the ship that was practically unsinkable. What does it mean to remember something you did not experience? This is the question that everyone who comes to this story after a certain point is living with. All of us now are people who were not there, who are working from accounts and photographs and the wreck at the bottom of the ocean, from the memories of people who are themselves now gone. The primary sources have all become secondary. The living witnesses are all history. And yet the story does not feel historical in the way that some stories feel historical, distant, settled, belonging to a world that is over. It feels present or near present, in the way that certain kinds of loss feel present long after they are past. The cold Atlantic on that particular night, the tilting deck, the music, the mathematics of the lifeboats. These things have a quality that pulls people in, that makes them feel real in a way that older disasters do not quite manage. Perhaps it is the specificity. The names are known, many of them. The positions are known, and the times, and the sequence of decisions, and the contents of the wireless messages. The story has been reconstructed to a degree that is unusual for events of its era. The inquiries were thorough. The survivors were numerous enough to provide multiple perspectives. The technical analysis has been ongoing for a century. You can, if you sit with it long enough, feel the shape of that night with an unusual precision. Or perhaps it is that the night itself produced the kind of behaviour that human beings need to understand. The full range of it, from the engineers who stayed at their posts to the quartermaster who would not go back for survivors, from the couple who would not be separated to the people who pushed others aside in the dark. This is what people do when the ordinary structures of their lives are taken away. This is what is left when you remove the context that makes normal behaviour possible and replace it with 2 hours and 40 minutes of cold Atlantic night and a ship that is going down. We are still learning from it. The modern maritime safety regime, the lifeboat standards, the drill requirements, the continuous wireless watch, the ice patrol, emerged directly from the lessons of April 1912, the Costa Concordia disaster in 2012, which occurred almost exactly 100 years later, demonstrated that complacency and poor emergency planning could still produce catastrophe, even in an era of far better technology, and the comparison with Titanic was immediate and instructive. The lessons have to be relearned, it seems, in each generation that forgets them. The ship is down there. The cold ocean is above her. The stars that watched her go are still overhead, the same stars watching the same ocean, knowing nothing about any of it. And somewhere in the dark, very far below the surface, in the sediment and the slow work of the bacteria and the movements of the deep ocean creatures that have no interest in human history, the bow of a ship is resting in the same position it has rested in since 2:20 in the morning of April the 15th, 1912. The railing is still there, the anchor chains are still there. The mud has risen around the bow to cover some of what was once visible. The rusticles have done their patient work. She's still there, and in another sense she's been in this story with us for the past several hours, and she will stay in it for as long as you carry it with you, which may be longer than you expect. Stories have a way of doing that, of continuing to be present in the mind that received them, of coming back in the half-awake moments of morning or the drowsy edges of sleep. If this one comes back to you, let it. There is more in it than any one night can hold. The century that followed the sinking of Titanic was a century that gave ample opportunity to test the lessons the disaster was supposed to have taught. The First World War began 2 years later, in 1914, the same year that the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was signed, and the war sank more ships in 4 years than the entire previous history of maritime commerce. The lessons of Titanic were real, but they operated in a world that kept producing new ways for ships to go wrong. The Lusitania was sunk by a German torpedo in May 1915, 3 years after Titanic, with a loss of nearly 1,200 lives. She sank in 18 minutes, too fast for any orderly evacuation, too fast for most of the lifeboats to be properly deployed. The lesson of Titanic about lifeboat capacity was present in the Lusitania's design. The lesson about how fast a ship could sink in certain circumstances was not. Each disaster teaches its own specific lesson, and the lessons do not fully transfer. The Andrea Doria sank in 1956 after a collision with the Stockholm in fog off the coast of New England. 52 people died. The Andrea Doria had adequate lifeboats and reasonably competent evacuation procedures, but the fog and the collision damage and the complications of mid-ocean rescue still produced deaths that better preparation might have prevented. The pattern persisted. New ships, new disasters, new specific combinations of circumstances that the previous disaster's lessons had not quite prepared for. The Costa Concordia ran aground off the coast of Tuscany in January 2012. 32 people died, and the comparisons with Titanic were immediate and extensive. Both were large ships. Both represented failures of seamanship and emergency response. Both produced stories of passengers left to fend for themselves, while officers made decisions that were later questioned. The 100 years between the two disasters had produced vastly better technology, satellite navigation, modern communications, vastly improved lifeboat systems, and had not eliminated the human factors that both disasters shared. The human factors are persistent because the human factors are not primarily technical. They are about the relationship between individuals and institutions, about the gap between what emergency procedures require and what people under pressure actually do, about the way that authority functions or fails to function in crisis situations, about the particular difficulty of making good decisions when the decisions have to be made quickly and the information is incomplete, and the consequences of being wrong are enormous. This is why the Titanic disaster remains relevant to people who work in fields as far removed from maritime history as aviation safety, hospital emergency management, nuclear power plant operation, and organizational behavior. The disaster is a case study in the failure mode of complex systems that work well under normal conditions and that fail in ways that are catastrophic and partly predictable when a specific combination of circumstances pushes them past their design limits. Charles Perrow, a sociologist who wrote about what he called normal accidents that are not the result of individual failures but of the way complex systems interact, used the Titanic disaster as one of his examples. The ship was well designed, by the standards of the time. The crew was competent. The technology was the best available, and yet the system failed, because the system had been designed for conditions that differed in specific ways from the conditions that actually obtained on the night of April the 14th, and those differences were not random but were built into the assumptions that the system was designed around. The iceberg warning system, or rather the absence of one, was an assumption. Ships communicated ice positions to each other as a courtesy, but there was no systematic monitoring, no official authority responsible for tracking ice and warning ships, no requirement that ships respond to ice warnings with any specific action. The assumption was that individual captains, exercising their professional judgment, would make appropriate decisions when ice warnings were received. Captain Smith exercised his professional judgment and made the decision that was consistent with standard practice. The standard practice was wrong in the specific circumstances of the night of April the 14th, because the specific circumstances included factors that standard practice had not accounted for. The unusual southerly extent of the ice field that year, the particular flatness of the sea that eliminated the telltale foam that normally marks the base of icebergs, the absence of the moon, the limitations of human vision in a dark without binoculars. After Titanic, the International Ice Patrol was established to do what individual captains could not: to systematically monitor the ice, to track the bergs as they moved south in the spring melt, to issue official warnings with specific positions and recommended courses. The Ice Patrol has been doing this work since 1914. It still does it. Its methods have evolved. It uses satellites now and aircraft and sophisticated modelling. But the core function is the same function that was established in response to the disaster: systematic monitoring, official warnings, coordinated safety. The record is notable. Since the Ice Patrol was established, no ship that has followed its warnings has been lost to ice in the North Atlantic. One ship that ignored a warning was lost in 1959. Every other ship that has followed the system has been safe. The system works. It was built from the specific failure of a specific night, and it has been working for more than a century. This is the kind of legacy that is easy to overlook because it is defined by absence, by the ships that did not sink, the people who did not die, the disasters that did not happen because a system was built to prevent them. The absence of catastrophe is harder to see than its presence, harder to attribute to any particular cause, harder to use as a narrative about the value of preparation and systems and institutional memory. But the absence is real, and it is a consequence of Titanic. The wireless regulations are similar. The requirement for continuous watch, the rule that a ship's wireless operator must monitor the distress frequency at all times, that the wireless cannot be turned off, that no ship can go silent the way the Californian went silent on the night of April the 14th, has been in force since shortly after the disaster. It has been updated as the technology has changed. The principle remains: ships must be reachable, must be able to send and receive emergency communications at all times. The lifeboat regulations are the most straightforward legacy. Every passenger on every ocean-going vessel now has a lifeboat seat. The calculations are based on the number of people aboard, not the tonnage of the ship. The drills are mandatory. The equipment is inspected. The crew members know their emergency assignments before the voyage begins. These rules exist because more than 1,500 people died in the North Atlantic in April 1912, partly because none of these things were required. The disaster also left a legacy in the culture of maritime safety, in the shared understanding among ship designers, operators, regulators and crew that the sea is dangerous, that technology cannot eliminate this danger, that preparation and vigilance and the honest acknowledgement of risk are the only adequate responses to what the ocean actually contains. This cultural legacy is harder to measure than regulatory compliance, but it is real, and it shows up in the way maritime professionals talk about safety, in the protocols that they follow, in the instincts that their training develops. And then there is the other legacy, the one that lives in the books and the films and the accounts and the stories, in the conversations that people have been having about the disaster for more than 100 years. This legacy is different in character from the regulatory one. It is not about preventing specific technical failures. It is about what the disaster means, what it reveals about human nature and human institutions and the human relationship with the natural world, what it says about class and courage, and the way different people in the same crisis respond in ways that reflect who they were before the crisis began. This legacy keeps finding new audiences because the questions it raises are not historical questions. They are not questions about the specific situation of 1912, about the specific regulations of the British Board of Trade, or the specific practices of the North Atlantic shipping industry. They are questions about what people are like, about what institutions are like, about what happens when the structures that normally organize human life are suddenly removed, and people have to act on what they actually are rather than on what the structures require them to be. These questions have no final answers. They keep being asked because the answers are always partial, always dependent on the specific circumstances of the asker, always revealing something new when the story is approached from a different angle. And the story is large enough to accommodate this. It has been examined from every angle that 112 years of attention can generate, and it still has something to offer to the next person who comes to it. It is late now, later than when we began, deeper into the night, into the quiet that settles when the world has done its talking and is ready to be still. The ship has gone. The people have arrived in New York. The inquiries have spoken. The regulations have been written. The decades have passed. And here you are, in your particular night, in your particular room, having travelled with this story as far as it will take you. There is something I want to say about the ship before we let her go completely, before the story settles back into the deep from which it came. She was beautiful. Whatever she became in the final hours, the site of disaster, the subject of inquiry, the cause of 1,500 deaths, she was first a beautiful thing, built with care and skill by people who cared about what they were building. Thomas Andrews had spent months designing her, had thought about the placement of every door handle, had walked her decks in Belfast with the pleasure of someone who knows a fine thing when they encounter one, and knows it especially when they have made it themselves. The passengers who boarded in Southampton had commented on this. The first-class travellers who had been aboard many ships said she was different, that the quality of the materials was exceptional, that the light in the rooms was particularly good, that the food was extraordinary, that there was something about the scale of her that made even the people who were used to luxury feel that they were encountering something beyond what they had encountered before. The third-class passengers who had never been aboard anything like her were amazed in a simpler and perhaps more genuine way. They walked the decks of the world's largest ship and felt the particular small joy of being somewhere magnificent, when magnificence is not something you have had occasion to expect. The ship existed for 12 days. She was launched on May the 31st, 1911, and she sank on April the 15th, 1912, and in between those two events she had her sea trials and her delivery voyage, and her 4 days crossing the Atlantic with 2,200 people aboard. 12 days. The largest ship in the world existed for 12 days. There is a way of thinking about this that is very sad, and there is a way of thinking about it that is less sad. The sad way is the obvious one. The less sad way is to notice that she was in the world at all, that the 15,000 men in the Belfast shipyard had made something, had built something that stood at the edge of what human engineering in that moment was capable of, and that the thing they built was real, was actual, was in the water and moving and full of people for 12 days. The 12 days happened. They were real. The food in the first-class dining room was excellent. The musicians played well. The children explored the corridors and were delighted by the rivets. The engineers kept the engines running and felt pride in that. The 12 days happened, and they cannot be taken back, and in that sense the ship is not only a disaster but also a thing that was, that existed, that gave people something for the time it was there. This is a small consolation. It is a real one. The water at the bottom of the North Atlantic is very cold. Cold enough that it preserves things. The ship's hull, the artifacts in the debris field, the wine bottles that are still intact in the cellar section of the bow. Cold is a form of preservation. Cold slows everything down. Cold is the condition in which things are held. You are warm. Wherever you are warm in the way that the people in the lifeboats were not warm, in the way that the ship's lower decks were not warm in the final hours, in the way that the Atlantic itself was not warm. You have that. It is not nothing. In fact, it is a great deal. The warmth of a room, the warmth of blankets, the warmth that allows the body to do what it is trying to do right now, which is to move towards sleep with the confidence that sleep is safe, that it will not be interrupted, that the morning will come and the ship will still be here and the day will be ordinary. Sleep is such a strange act of trust. Every night, without much thinking about it, we allow consciousness to go, allow the body to take over, allow the world to proceed without our monitoring. The people on Titanic were doing this. They were asleep, most of them, when the collision happened, and the collision was so quiet that most of them slept through it, and only the ones who were already awake or who were very lightly sleeping heard the faint shudder of the hull and the brief change in the engine sound. Most of them went right back to sleep. The ship was fine. The night was quiet. There was nothing to be alarmed about. They sank back into their pillows and their berths and their blankets and let themselves drift, and the ship continued moving, and the night continued being a night, and sleep continued doing what sleep does. Let yourself do what they did in those last ordinary minutes of that ordinary night, before anything had changed and everything was still ahead. Let yourself sink back. Let the ship carry you. The engines are a low hum. The stars are out. The sea is very still. You do not need to know what comes next. You are in the part before it. The part where everything is possible and nothing has been decided, and the night is long, and the bed is warm, and the only thing that is required of you is to be still, and to breathe, and to let the rest of it go. Let the rest of it go. The North Atlantic in April in the dark with the stars reflected in water so still it might be glass. The sound of engines somewhere below. The sound of a few voices somewhere above, talking quietly about ordinary things. The sound of the water against the hull, which is a sound like breathing, regular and low and without intention. You are on the ship. You are in the part before. The ship is whole and the night is quiet and the people are sleeping in their cabins and berths and bunks, all around you, all the way up and all the way down, their dreams mixing with the sound of the engines and the sound of the water and the cold and brilliant stars overhead. This is a night that happened. This is a ship that was. These are people who slept and woke and made their choices in the dark. They were real. They were here. And now they are the kind of real that only stories can hold, the kind that lives in the space between one person's sleep and another, in the hours when the day is over and the next day has not yet decided what it is going to be. Sleep. The story is done. The ship has gone where it was going. The people have gone where they were going. The cold Atlantic is above the wreck and the stars are above the Atlantic and the dark is between the stars, and you're in a warm room that is not a ship, that will not sink, that will still be here when morning comes. Sleep. Let the water carry you down, not to 2.5 miles, not to the cold dark floor of the ocean, but to the particular depth that is yours tonight, the depth that is exactly as far as you need to go to find what sleep is. It is quiet there. It has always been quiet there. Nothing is required of you. The ship lies in the deep. The band stopped playing a long time ago. The stars made their long arc across the sky and the sun rose and the day came and the world went on, as it does, as it will, as it always has. And somewhere in the dark of this night, in the particular geography of your particular bed, you are going the same direction as everything goes in the quiet hours, toward rest, toward the long pause, toward the place that belongs to no clock and no history and no account. Go there, you've earned it. The night is long enough. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. What aspect of the Titanic story stayed with you longest? Was it the band that played until the end? The engineers who kept the lights on? The mathematics of the lifeboats? Or someone whose name you heard tonight for the first time?